Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Scorpion Movement Podcast. This is episode 14. Today, I'm joined by author, musician, audiobook narrator, and all-around creative and content creator, Shazam Watkins. We're very excited to speak to you today, as well as my good friend and usual co-host, Jacob Raczynski. Now, as usual, I'm going to begin this podcast by allowing you, the guest, Shazam, to briefly introduce yourself to the audience and to our viewers who might not be familiar with you and your work before transitioning to a more back and forth Q&A, as well as a more free-flowing and spontaneous conversation, perhaps, depending on how exactly the discussion progresses. Similar to what we've done with past guests on this podcast, such as Charlie Looker, Giovanni Panicetti, etc., so on and so forth. And just so that we don't unnecessarily forestall the actual discussion, with that being said, Shazam, feel free to take it away. And then afterwards, Jacob, if you'd be interested, I'd allow you to ask some of the first questions. And I think that's how we should proceed. So just introduce yourself to the audience. I mean, tell them what you do, what you've been doing, how you do it.
Yeah. Well, thank you guys very much for having me on. It's awesome to meet both of you. It was fun conversing with Jacob prior and watching some of you guys' other conversations that you've had. It was pretty flattering, just judging by some of the caliber of guests that you've had on. So it's an honor to be here. My name is Shazam Watkins, or that's what I go by online. I am a Christian male. I was the son of a pastor, evangelical pastor, and I was homeschooled. I was signed to a major label for music, and I kind of got disillusioned with the music industry after a lot of different things. I did a lot of different things prior to even a label signing. And then after that, I got into books, which was something, I grew up doing. I grew up listening to audiobooks a lot. I always kind of wanted to make my own. And as music became something, like I said, I was disillusioned with, I started going into the need for audiobooks in the dissident side of things, because a lot of the ones that I was listening to were shit. So I just felt like I really could encapsulate and perform audiobooks for these types of people in a way that would reflect, I guess, excellence. And there's a definite difference between independent recordings and major label recordings, just like there are with audiobooks, just like there are with book editing, things like that. So I wanted to put forward these thoughts and ideas and truths in a way that was powerful, that would affect people, and that could stand up to, I guess, the quality that most people ingest when they're listening to something like professionally, or watching a professional show, or listening to a professionally produced band. Through doing those audiobooks, the music thing really was destroyed, cancellation and stuff like that. So I basically lost most everything contact wise for music in like the major music making business after doing those books. And that just kind of inspired me to go further down that path. So I continued to make audiobooks for people that I like. I still make them under different names for, projects that I might not necessarily want to include under that umbrella. I still make music, and I started writing my own books as well, and released my first one in 2022. So right now I do music, books, audiobooks. I edit for people as well. I've done some ghostwriting. And I also read books to people on YouTube, just as like a fun thing, mostly fiction, fantasy, stuff like that, because I like doing accents, voices. So yeah, that's a
That's
little
also
bit about me.
that's interesting. There's so many ideas that just came to mind. There's so many connections, but I think a good way to start here, unless Jacob, you want to interject right now, but once I think this is important. I want to get this out of the way first. Is when it comes to, for instance, some of the audiobook narration work that you've done. I initially found out about something like Mike Maw a couple of years ago, just because I think, both you and I, Shazam, really all three of us inhabited some of the same online spaces, you could say. I don't want to be too specific when I'm describing the space, because I don't want to give the wrong impression of what exactly it is. And I don't really like to box myself or anything that I do, or rather, I don't like to subsume anything that I do into a very specific and clearly delineated box, category, or outline, because I think that that's very restrictive creatively speaking, and really limits and impedes what you can do. But you can nonetheless say that we all inhabited a certain space. And I think, as I say that, you guys probably know what I'm talking about. And within those types of spaces, like you said, these dissident online spaces, there is actually this very potent artistic and creative dimension that doesn't really get talked about a lot, at least not within more mainstream circles, mainstream media circles, the established institutions. Whenever they talk about the internet and certain more fringe spaces on the internet, their coverage is almost entirely negative. It's filled with pejoratives. It paints the entirety of the scene, you could say, if you want to call it a scene, in a very negative and disparaging light. And I think in doing so, they actually obscure a very fundamental fact, which is that I think over the course of late modernity, you could say, not to sound too pretentious here, there's a fundamental shift that occurs within the domain of social life. And just to speed this up and to not be too long-winded here, you see that increasingly cultural and social phenomena actually begin to manifest in online spaces. And I think what occurs as a result of that is, whereas writers, musicians, artists, so on and so forth, would have once frequented, for instance, cafes or certain neighborhoods within certain cool cities, they now basically treat the internet as that giant cafe, in a sense, to simplify it. And I think as a result of that, you've seen actually that the most interesting, the most subversive, just the coolest really work that's happening nowadays is actually largely happening online. And I think that's where someone like Mike Mall comes into play here. And how he's significant for me is, well, I found out about books like Harassment Architecture, Gothic Violence. I was super fascinated with them. I thought that the vibe was sick. It just felt edgy and cool and kind of seductive in a weird way. And then I actually found, and this is actually how I bonded with Jacob part. We can get into some of the personal history a little bit later if you guys would be interested. But then I found his Spotify profile, and I saw that he had this playlist. And I thought, that's interesting, because I didn't really expect us to have similar music interests. But I saw the bands that were on this playlist, and I thought, man, this guy has definitely been down some of the same rabbit holes that I have in terms of just exploring the world of underground music. He had some really cool, really niche artists on there that I didn't really expect. And so what comes to mind for me as a result of that is, it seems to me to be the case that there's this interconnection between the world of underground music, right? Underground, experimental, perhaps indie music, if you're okay with that term, and similarly experimental art and literature and intellectualism and the noosphere really within the domain of online life, basically, in the contemporary world. And why that's significant to you and what you do, I think, is because it seems like you've managed to manifest those connections within your own life. So with that being said, how about you take us to that musical dimension? I'm really, really curious to know about this, because I'm actually a musician too. I've been obsessed with music since I was a little kid, and it's still a very important part of my life. So I'd be really interested to know, actually, how did you get into music, and what was your musical journey really like, in a sense, and how did that interconnect later with other creative ventures like writing and audiobooks and so on and so forth, basically?
Yeah. For music specifically, music was always tied to a very spiritual place for me.
Yeah.
Obviously grew up in church, and my dad was a pastor. I had 4 brothers, and all of them were involved to some degree or another in making music within the church, which is, specifically spiritual. There's a lot of emphasis on performance in Christian music, especially evangelical music. Obviously not so much like Catholicism, although they're really tied. So music for me was more of a feeling rather than it wasn't, I had no interest in being a chamber musician. So
Yeah.
being like some sort of classical trained person who could just read and go from there. I was always more interested in what I could create myself. And then within the feeling that it evoked from people. In church music, there's a lot of up and down in dynamic. So it's almost more of like a jazz band than it is like a TV performance or even concert. For
I
modern
see.
music, you have moments where the music steps back and you are playing to, I don't know, tickle people's spiritual fervor, if that makes sense. So there's a
Yeah.
lot of ups and downs in it. There's a lot of dynamic and shift, and you get a real read for how it affects people on a
Yeah.
deeper level. So music for me was that. I started with piano. I was classically trained in piano for probably 6 or 7 years growing up. Um, and through that, I started picking up other instruments like drums, guitar here and there, and the voice has always been my favorite. Um,
Yeah.
I really, obviously, that kind of translates into audiobooks as well. So the journey from there was I knew that I wanted to make my own music, and me and my younger brother really just started kind of writing our own stuff very early on and finding bands. I mean, we weren't really allowed to listen to too much music. We were in a household that my mother was very, very careful about what we were ingesting in our ears, and so for us, it was limitation. But limitation kind of always breeds. Um, in my opinion, I think limitless possibility is really the only way that you can go from limitation, which is kind of going back to what you were saying about online spaces. I have a lot of thoughts about that as well with limitation and the art that goes along with those things. But to continue on with the music, we just I started playing around with bands. Um, we each played in different groups, and then in Washington State, around Seattle, my brother and I just started making this electronic alternative kind of dance music at that time. And then we started playing shows and got label attention, got signed, toured. We were put into studios in LA to do session work with a lot of really big producers who've worked with, I don't know, names that you would be familiar with. So we had a lot of contacts within the music business, just from relationship that we built kind of from the ground up. We had really nobody that worked there. A lot of family members oftentimes have label people or A&R people that are within the family, but it was pretty much natural growth for us, which I pride myself on. But at the same time, because we were raised independently of the agenda that's put forth by a lot of, Hollywood or major music making
Yeah, of course.
force, um, we didn't really fit too well in that sphere. Um, and we kept kind of being pushed towards having some sort of agenda for us because we were glam oriented, like we liked David Bowie and clothing like that and stuff.
Yeah.
So we were pushed towards this kind of transgender rights thing, and that's really how you would have success in music. Is all you have to do is pick. You have to be somewhat talented. You have to have somewhat catchy music, and then you have to just pick whatever shaming ritual that you want to portray to the masses,
Yeah.
and then you're pretty much good. I wasn't okay with that. Neither was my brother. So, um, really, in rebellion of that, we were kind of in a label undertow, just stuck in writing. They really didn't want to put money behind anything. Labels are essentially like banks. They just loan you money, which you then have to pay back infinitely. Uh, so we weren't interested in that, and then I basically started to branch out into why can't I say this? Why can't I talk like this? Why can't I express these things that you might be finding in the dissonant spaces that you're talking about? And
Yeah.
so I just decided to do an audiobook for Mike. I reached
Oh,
out to him online, and then that's kind of when cancellation happened. So everything fell apart with music, which was really the best thing that ever happened to me. I loved it. It hurt in the moment. It was painful in the moment to lose relationships, friendships. This was all happening during COVID as well, or right before. Um, and then after that, it's kind of just been freedom from there. And like I said, limitation breeds infinite
yeah.
possibility. So
Listen, but before we get into the topic of Mike Mo and his works, 'cause obviously I'm highly fascinated about him. When it comes to music, there were certain statements that you made that particularly intriguing because it seems like we have fairly distinct musical backgrounds. And because you mentioned that you actually started playing Christian music, right? Like specifically religious music, or music with religious overtones, you could say, right? Is that correct to say?
that's not necessarily what we were writing when we had a band that was signed, but
No,
starting within the church music. Yeah.
just earlier on, like that's how you're first exposed to music in a sense, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So the cultural context in which you were immersed as a child, that heavily influenced your initial exposure to music, basically, right? If I'm getting that correct.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
yeah.
To
Because
this
then
day, my favorite album was made by a guy that he's no longer a Christian, but he was in a Christian band, I think in the late 90s. So yeah.
Yeah, that in a sense to me, maybe I'm just reading too much into it, but that seems to have foreshadowed perhaps some of the later work that you would engage in other ventures. Because if I think about, obviously in your own book, A Fool's Renaissance, and in the book readings that you actually do on your channel, I think if I'm, like you said, you narrate excerpts from various fiction and fantasy books. If I'm not mistaken, I think you've been reading some. What was it? Some of Tolkien's works or something like that. I think I saw that
Yeah,
on
I
your.
recorded The Hobbit on there.
Yeah,
I've also done Bible
yeah,
readings on there. So
that
yeah.
was his works cannot really be understood without a decent understanding, let's say, or a decent grounding in reading scripture and biblical scripture and certain classic Christian theological ideas or ideas that are taken from the Christian tradition. And I see that similar sense of sacrality and transcendence manifest actually, and this is going to sound so strange, in the writings of someone like Mike Moore. I know that sounds kind of weird, but that idea of this rebellious, transgressive figure that basically operates on the margins of society, not as a result of any moral failings, right? So it's not the case that that individual is morally unjust in some way, or that they engage in morally impermissible actions. You know, Mike Ma, he doesn't strike me as a particularly moralistic person, so he might differ in regards to his interpretation and his reading of his own work, really. But this transgressive figure, like I said, they operate in the margins of society because, in a sense, they are actually more pure than society itself, in that they would like to really to live and to fight, and in a sense to even die, because I don't really think that death can actually be extricated from life itself. They're fundamentally intertwined in this very dialectical way, and I think that's actually an important Christian idea as well, I'd say. But this archetype of the individual that seeks to live, fight, and die for some type of higher cause or some higher transcendent purpose that actually outlives oneself, that is eternal and that is actually good and true in this absolute Platonic sense. That, in a sense, is why they've actually been cast out and extricated from society. That's why they're a transgressive figure. And that to me is exactly what is embodied really in the figure of Christ, you know, and in biblical verses that talk about how faith shall be spread by the sword and so on and so forth. That
Jordan,
archetype to me is really, really
really
interesting.
quick, could
So
I expand on that and ask some questions of my own
yeah,
after you're done with this exchange?
yeah, go ahead, because I think we're exploring a really interesting idea here, actually.
I
But yeah,
meant
go ahead.
after Shazam, comments on what you've said, if that's all right.
Oh,
Yeah,
yeah,
no, I'll keep it brief so that you can keep running with your thoughts.
no,
Yeah, keep going. Sorry.
I was just going to say, I know it's somewhat vague, and this actually does relate to the music in a different way, because I do think that regardless of what one does in life, and obviously people can change over the course of their lives, I think there still exists this core personality that underlies basically everything that they do. I think that that is mostly immutable, and it actually expresses itself in different domains of activity. So that's why I'm really honing in on this archetype, this very Christian, or this very traditionally Christian and biblical archetype that I see in actually some of the work that we all do. Basically, I think that's what unites us. But I know that it's very vague. But I was just wondering if that
Yeah, that
it
resonates heavily with me.
be some interesting ideas or insights to just bounce off of. Because, like I said, this is going to be a very free flowing conversation. I don't want to stick to a very pre-written, scripted format for this one. I think this is actually a lot more interesting. So
Sure.
yeah,
Yeah, I would say you're spot on with a lot of that. For me, again, it can all kind of be boiled down to, as you said, life and death. They're completely intertwined, and it's in biblical text to die to oneself.
yeah,
So the self is really not important. Societal issues are really not important. Again, biblically, like the battle is not flesh and blood. So yes, to live and die with this sort of conviction is, in my opinion, true strength. As you said, it's more pure, which is one of the reasons I've chosen to work with who I've worked with. Is not even it's not political. It's kind of a freeing of that
exactly.
sports game. So it's really, as much as there could be a left wing or right wing leanings in either of the works, I always say it's a circle more than it is sides. The further left you go, you have environmental um, priorities and food priorities, and those are good priorities. We want to take care of the earth. We want to eat good food. Those are generally associated with democratic principles. And then you have gun rights, things like freedom. Those are associated with the right. So to me, freeing yourself from that illusion as well is a huge part of it. But that's, I think, what Christ was trying to do as well. And so, yes, to be Christ-like at the end of the day might be to die on that hill, as it were. I don't know. And
Yeah,
I just don't believe in compromising at
exactly.
all. There is no compromise to me. Like, it's already very decided in my mind. Even with you and some of the things I've listened to on your guys' podcast, you're very much about philosophy, right?
Hmm.
Yeah, it's
And you probably have studied all of them a lot more than I have. I delved into a lot of heavy philosophy when I was like 2016, 2018.
yeah,
And the general consensus that I got is none of them knew what the fuck they were talking about. All of them were in love with themselves. They were against each
yeah,
other. And at the end of the day, they mostly had bad ends. Um, and that doesn't mean that there aren't things that they say that are wonderful or amazing or life changing, but or inspiring. But at the end of the day, like, biblical truth is where I go back to. That's my foundation, and that's my conviction. And so, whether or not it results in some sort of earthly success really has nothing to do with it. I don't care about
exactly.
that. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I completely agree to that on that. I think you said many profound things there, but one statement that particularly stood out to me was this idea that, in a sense, and we've actually talked about this on some previous podcasts before. We had this one podcast called, it was called, yeah, the specific title was Cybernetics, Game Theory, and the End of History. And it was almost an intellectual history in a sense, in that we aim to look at certain 20th century intellectual developments and how they gave birth to the world that we live in today, which is basically this post-historical world in almost Hegelian sense, where it seems as if it's no longer really quite possible to actually fight and die for any type of ideal or any virtuous cause. And that type of struggle, that dialectical struggle, seems to have basically been extricated from the domain of life itself. And to me, when I think of, and then you mentioned this idea of the political and how, in a sense, some of the work that ostensibly political figures within, for instance, dissident rights spaces do is actually not political, really. It's only
Mm.
political surface, and it's actually, in a sense, aiming to free oneself and to transcend the domains of politics. I found that to be a really, really interesting idea. But for me, how I would think of it is like this, and I'm going to use this to branch off and form various interesting interconnections, interesting rhizomes of the sort, right? But when I think about the political and what politics actually means, because what's interesting about the term is that we largely presuppose that we know what it is in everyday life, right? You know, if you introduce yourself to someone and you talk about your hobbies, your interests, or whatever, anything else of the sort, you might say, "Oh, I'm a politics junkie." So some people say that, right? Especially people, particularly online, because I'm interested in politics, and we talk about politics all the time. It's probably one of the most common and frequent and really incessant obsessions and preoccupations of most people in the contemporary world, I'd say, or at least in the America and other Western countries. But it seems to me like people don't even have a clear grasp on what exactly politics is. And I don't think fundamentally that politics is reducible to this very technocratic, cold, and calculated domain of almost acting as some type of managerial administrator or boss of sorts, this corporate boss that just tries to oversee society and determine what is best for each individual sector of society. That acts as just optimizing agent of sorts, if you know what I mean. I think that's what most people think of as falling within the domain of political activity, right? And so that's why if you ask someone about politics, a more normie-oriented person, and I know some people don't really like that term, but I think it's actually applicable here. Not to sound like a
Yeah. No, it's not pretentious.
dick or anything, but I do think that there are actually, if you want, we can talk about that. That's kind of a funny concept, that idea of normies, elitists, plebeians, patricians, to use the Chan terminology in a sense. But I do think that normies actually exist, and I think that if you ask someone who has a more normie mainstream disposition about what politics is, they'd immediately tell you that, oh, well, it encompasses phenomena like tax policy, environmental policy, urban policy, whatever ideas are contained within a given candidate, say AOC or Bernie's policy platform. And I think you were also hinting at this. I don't think that domain is completely insignificant, right? We should try to protect the environment, and we should try to do so not solely through our words, right, through speech and language, or through actual actions. Like, right, we should try to implement policies that make the world a better place. I think really only a psychopath or someone who's just a misanthrope would disagree with that. But at the same time, to me, that's not really what politics is actually reducible to. And the last thing I'll say on this regard is because I think it makes it quite clear what I'm getting at, and it makes clear why the works of someone like Mike Maw are significant. Like even despite the fact that they're filled with violence and they're pretty edgy to most people, and most people with a more moralistic sensibility could say probably wouldn't really get it at first, even though it is imbued with a very profound moral fervor, right? A dedication to moral behavior in a sense, is because to me, I take my cues on thinking about politics from this thinker named Carl Schmitt. I don't know if you've heard of him, but he's heavily influenced me actually. He was this 20th century German figure. He's associated with the conservative revolution. And I'm going to allow you guys to riff off of this after, because I know I've been speaking for a long time, but I think you're going to get the point. And his idea of politics was that, okay, what politics is it's not reducible to any set of particular policies or even ideas, but it's actually reducible to a single dialectic, which would be the friend-enemy distinction. That there's one group that group has a certain identity, that they will live and die for that identity, and that fact, in a sense, pits them against other groups that are engaging in the same process. So for him, conflict and struggle were actually really the source and the definition of politics in a sense. And it seems to me to be the case that as history progresses and as liberalism takes hold, this paradox arises, and that liberalism was ostensibly political ideology, but really, and this is actually a point that Schmitt would echo, it's predicated upon, in a sense, the elimination of politics as well, politics itself, because it sublates conflict and struggle into this cyclical domain of consumption and production, where we just try to min-max and micromanage society, basically. But there's no overarching struggle that we're actually bound to. And I think for various people, or for many people, that might seem like a positive development at first, because it's oh, well, the rate of the incidence of wars will go down, right? Poverty will go down, as well. People are going to be less violent. You have these pop intellectuals and pop scientists like Steven Pinker, who say that the best thing about the modern world is that it's becoming safer and less violent every day. But there's a sense in which I think that extrication of struggle from the domain of life itself is actually hostile to the spirit of life, basically. There are just some people out there who have that warrior mindset. I know that sounds corny, but they live for the fight. They live for the struggle. And I think if those types of people don't have a higher cause to really fight and die and strive for, they're actually going to fall into really a state of depression and despair on a really deep level. And I think that's actually what not only people like Mike Maw are getting at in their works, but really, in a sense, many of the more interesting and creatively inclined segments of the dissident right. I think that's what the struggle really entails, if you see what I'm getting at. So it's just as much an artistic struggle as it is a political one. So that was very long-winded, but that when you talked about how this isn't really about politics, but it's about spirituality and art in a sense, it just made me really think about, well, what does politics actually entail in a sense? But those would be my thoughts. So I know again it was very long-winded and digressive, but if you guys found anything interesting in that stream of consciousness, just feel free to riff off of it, I guess. Like I said, I mean,
Yeah, I'd like Shazam to comment on it first, if you have any thoughts.
I was about to say the same thing to you.
Okay, fair enough.
Yeah, do you have, because I know you were waiting before, but
Yeah, fair enough.
but I think we're getting some interesting themes here to definitely work off of. So
I think we went a little bit too much into the correlation between music and art and politics. I mean, obviously there's a trifecta between that. But regarding art and like its actual influence, as you stated, I actually did want to ask Shazam about his book, A Fool's Renaissance. So I know that there was a long-winded process behind making that, and that narrating an audiobook or even participating actively and how it's being voiced and how it's being portrayed to the world is not the same as writing a book. So I wanted to, talk about the inspirations that you've had with writing that book. I've actually been haunted by the ghost of Jimmy Carter right now while making this podcast, so I
oh, he tore
apologize
down
for
your
the
flag.
yeah, I apologize for the breaking of the setup behind me. It appears that I've erred him. But yeah, I did think it was an interesting point to touch down upon because even in more niche circles, such as when I was checking earlier on Goodreads to see how many people actually read the book. It seems that the book has gained quite a bit of attention and a lot of people like it. So, what was the inspiration behind it? What were the thoughts and the ideas that you went with?
Um, well, I wouldn't say it's gained that much attention. I think it's sold well for. I didn't think it would sell anything. Number
Hmm.
one, and that's not really the reason I wrote it at all. Um, I think that it kind of goes back to what Jordan was saying about the struggle. So I don't believe in fighting for nothing. I think that's probably something that plagues dissonance a lot, is like this undefinable thing that you're fighting for, which I don't really have that problem. I'm very much decided about what I'm fighting for. I definitely have conviction and foundation. I'm certain about it. I'm not asking questions just to ask questions, which is kind of one of the things I don't like about philosophy in general. Again, biblically, what does it say? But avoid foolish questions and genealogies and contentions and strivings about the law, for they're unprofitable and vain. It's like that to me is, yeah, avoid questions. It doesn't mean don't question things, but at the end of the day, if you don't really know what that thing is that you're fighting for, well, you're just fighting to
Yeah.
fight. Um, and so I think that's contentious and stupid. But for me, there really isn't. I have no problem about that. It's Christ and His kingdom, which really it's like that already solves the question of politics. Like, was Jesus a political person? No.
Mhm.
They would consider him to be one, and that's maybe initially what drew me to Mike's work as well, and Paul's work as well. Is um, it's not really political. Like when I first read Harassment Architecture, I wasn't struck by, wow, this is a great, example and argument for XYZ voting.
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
was just like, oh, well, separate yourself from this, focus on what the good, the true, the beautiful, all that can
Yeah.
be encapsulated by what? Well, the person that Jesus was. I don't really think that's where Mike was writing it from, necessarily either. I don't think that's necessarily where Paul writes his work from. I don't really know specifically, how strong their conviction is in that idea. But to me, that's the idea: is fighting for something very much higher than yourself, but also being able to define what that is a big battle, I think, for some people.
Exactly.
And they can get distracted by, you know, questions of science and genealogies. It's like I like the idea of nationalism in a civilizational sense, because you can't really have it. You can't have a civilization without that
Yeah.
concept. Otherwise, it loses its identity, which means it's no longer a civilization. But that pales in comparison to the unity that Christianity would offer. Um, so, yeah, and I might be going off on a tangent here. I'm just trying to kind of comment on both.
No, it's
As
interesting.
as far as Fool's Renaissance, um, there are things I love about that book. There's things that I kind of hate about that book, just like any art that you would make. I'm sure you guys, Jordan, you making music, Jacob, I'm not sure if you make
I read
anything.
books. I read
Yeah.
books.
There you go. So the highest calling that we have, if this is your foundation, the truth that you abide by, is to be Christ-like, which is to say that you would be God-like. And the most fundamental characteristic of God is that He's a creator. So I believe that everything that you do is supposed to be from that perspective. It said, go out and subdue the entire earth. And the way that you subdue it is by creating marks upon it. So the book for me was just another act of creation. The music that I made was just another act of creation. It might not have come from that place necessarily. I think, part of music was business and connection and success in an earthly way. But as far as creating audiobooks, writing books, the innate purpose behind them is always like, well, creating makes me feel akin and closer to God, and releasing those things, whether they have some success or not, is not the validation. The validation is actually accomplishing them, creating them, bringing them into existence. So the book wasn't really to sell, it was to make. And through that making, if people pick it up, read it, are affected by it, and it creates some sort of wave in their own life where they're also accomplishing that for themselves, it's really bringing them closer to God in the same sense. As far as the topics, since I mean we could get into that too. Is that a good
No, actually,
does that work for
Yeah,
now?
Jordan, could I comment on that?
no, it's a great topic, and I'd love to talk about the Fool's Renaissance, obviously, and go into greater detail regarding that book because I'm highly interested by it. But I tend to be a bit more biographical in my approach, you could say, or a bit more historically focused, because I like to see how, for instance, whenever we interview someone, I like to see how their interests and their pursuits in life it shift over time to paint this picture of a narrative, basically. I tend to think of in terms of narrative stories, narrative structures. That's what I'm really interested in, especially nowadays. So I wanted to, because we talked about music, obviously, how you became disillusioned with the music industry because of the certain agendas and ideas that they wanted to shove down your throat, really, that you weren't fond of at all, that you rejected. It seems to me to be the case that after that, if I'm correct, and I'm not mistaken in this assumption, you transitioned first into, or rather, you were exposed to certain online spaces, and that's how you found out about people like Mike Moore, Paul, and Paul Town. So, what I'm interested in exploring right now in this podcast is basically in a metaphorical sense, immersing ourselves in that moment of your life right
I
now.
did
Mm,
want
What
to
was,
touch upon that.
yeah,
So
yeah,
there's something very profound that Shazam said that really
yeah,
resonated with me regarding the
yeah,
process of creation.
yeah, yeah.
So even within
No,
these
but
niche spaces as well as overall, I wanted to comment on the fact that he mentioned creating for the sense of creating. When I brought up the fact that the book was getting quite some attention, obviously it is something to brag about and it's something that is quite nice. It is better for a work to be received positively by a large number of people than for not to be received at all. That can be quite demotivating. But what I
yeah,
think is a powerful aspect when you're thinking about this from a Christian sense is creating for the sense of creating. So as you mentioned, creating something is in a Christian sense, bringing you closer to God, as it is imitating the purest act that, in many ways, that God has made, and the essence of creation inevitably links back to Scripture and Genesis and whatnot. But I'm sure that there is something about humans and our ability for consciousness and for actually sewing together ideas and making things that makes us feel good about ourselves. And I think in a lot of ways, me and Jordan have pondered on this together as well. The way
yeah,
in which our civilization actually markets the act of creation can be a bit of destructive at times, as everything is tied to the result of the process, which is not managed by you.
yes,
So when you debut an album or make a great work, um, more often than not, people do not look at the quality of the work, but how it is received. If someone is popular for the act of being popular and they haven't actually contributed much to the world, in the eyes of society, they are largely prized as more valuable than a niche artist whose work is actually of some quality. And what I think is the issue for a lot of people in solving that is to embrace the act of creation itself rather than delving into these very niche things about how is this work received or will people like it or is this going to make me rich and famous? Because in a majority of situations, not that is entirely due to luck, but that is pretty much out of people's hands and it is not something that they can control. More likely than not, great works that actually touch upon the subjects of the human condition or just tell a great story or are pleasurable to listen to, they won't be viewed by a lot of people because it kind of delves into intricate subjects that people may not want to expand
exactly.
upon or immerse themselves in.
Well, it's not necessarily,
So
I'd
I,
say.
I, I was curious about you, Shazam, in particular, because it seems like in a lot of your works, particularly in A Fool's Renaissance, you really wrote for the sake of writing rather than seeing how the work will be perceived by the vast majority of people. And I think that can be impactful and beneficial. And I was interested that you touched upon this in a Christian sense. I also agreed with the sentiment that you said that Jesus was not himself a political figure, because there was a study that I read a few years back where they asked people of right-leaning and left-leaning political affiliations in the U.S. Would Jesus vote Democrat or Republican? Would he be a liberal or conservative? And of course, if the person was religious, they answered that Jesus would be voting the same way that they're voting, because they don't want to deal with that cognitive dissonance. So nearly
mm,
everyone that classified themselves as religious responded that Jesus would actually think the same exact way that they're thinking, and everybody else is wrong and not Christ-like.
mm.
So I did like those sentiments. I did want to ask a little bit more about A Fool's Renaissance, particularly because in act writing for the sake of writing and the general philosophy that you touched a lot about a lot of a lot of topics which correlate to the fact that the music industry wasn't too proud of the fact that you were giving more abstract thoughts and you were voicing your actual own opinions instead of going with the mainstream. I'm sure that there was a lot of that connection within the actual process of writing it. I'm sure that that was something that spoke into your mind, like this won't be received well by some people, but I'm doing it because fuck it. So I was curious if that was something that you were thinking about.
Yeah, I would I say you kind of like hit it on the head. Um what you just said is creating for the sake of creating. Again, that's I think where the book came from was I feel like I was prior to working in the field that I work in now and doing the things that I do now, whether that's music or audiobooks or writing. I feel like for having success in the music industry, you are just creating for the sake of creating. You still love to do it. Um, it's fun to make music. It's fun to write things that are, have hit potential or radio potential or success potential at a greater scale. But that felt more soulless to me. So that would have been the point where I was creating for the sake of just creating, rather than creating from a point um, that would increase, or I guess encapsulate the voice that I was trying to put out into the world. So for pop music, it's like one of the main reasons I was getting disillusioned with it was because you are, in a sense, putting the masses to sleep. So you're really serving the devil in some sense. It's like, well, you're writing to momentarily make these people feel good, um, about the way that they're living, or you're trying, you're lulling them. Basically, you're acting as kind of a Grima Wormtongue in a Tolkien sense. You're whispering the things that they want to hear to them. um there really is no, we always tried to write from a perspective of maybe more substance, but even that substance had to be vague. And like I said, I really don't like vague. I really like specifics. So what are you saying? What do you mean? um and so A Fool's Renaissance, even the title, um I remember sending the title to my editor guy that I was paying, and he was like, I don't know if I want to, you don't want to really call yourself a fool, like, what does that even mean to you? But at the same time, it was like, because I'd evolved, or the book was also sort of a journey of thought for me. And so it's more like, well, this is the renaissance of the fool that is me. It doesn't mean I'm a retard. It just means, it just means like,
Yeah.
these things that I was doing before were the acts of a fool. Um, this is how I started to maybe rehabilitate myself or come to some enlightenment. Not that I have some crazy enlightenment, but again, it's the Renaissance, so it's an illumination, the fool's illumination, or fool's resurrection, or regeneration. Um, yeah, I don't
So
know.
it's,
Is
yeah.
that good?
Yes, it's
No.
sort of like a transfiguration. I get what you're saying, and I think in a lot of ways, there's a lot of bias nowadays, particularly in the US, to where
Yeah.
everybody must see themselves as being greater than everybody else, or you must acknowledge that you're without sin. And I think Christianity tells us in its rawest form from the Scripture, that that is not the case, and we all are prone to sin. And I think there was something that I saw a while ago, and it really illuminated it. Um, Someone said that the basis of pretty much the vast majority of Catholic prayers sum down to "Forgive me, God, for I am stupid and retarded and evil." Uh,
Mm.
and I think that has some truth to it. Like, I think when we touch upon these things, particularly philosophy or literature, a lot of the people that we cover were freaks that were outcasted by society, and they had these great ideas, and they thought they were greater in those ideas than everyone else. So, in large scale, we have all these competing philosophies of all these flawed people that themselves sometimes refuse to acknowledge that they were flawed. And what you get from that is because they lack to acknowledge that they have yet to make that renaissance, which is why I found the title so particularly interesting, because they fail to acknowledge that a lot of their inconsistencies fall flat. Because if you claim to be perfectly enlightened, and then you write one thing that may not entirely be the truth, that one mistake may be your downfall, and then the entire mask comes off. So I think there is grace in admitting. I think with these titles, when that deal with transformations and metamorphoses or transfigurations, right? That this is in fact a hero's journey. That's what all literature comes down to. So when you
Hmm.
have a story that you're trying to tell or a narrative that you're trying to give to the reader, I've noticed that admitting that not only your characters or the viewpoint that you're sharing may not be entirely true and that you should tend for something higher, admitting that the hero's journey that you're presenting is also true of the author in itself, as you're improving and touching upon these subjects, that this is just your perspective, that actually adds a lot more humbleness to the work. So that's what I was getting from your general description of the work. But no, I think the title does draw a lot of people in. I'm not sure if you've experienced this, but it's very often when you publish a book as an author, uh, there is a lot of people that not really so much skim it, but to take the work at its surface level, and a lot of the ideas that you're trying to convey necessarily fall flat, even if you spend 10 or 20 pages writing about something very specific. It just doesn't register with a lot of people. So I found that when a lot of people actually read my work, they tend to skim past the little monologues that add the actual context and flavor to it, and they go back to the actual story or what's happening or what point I'm trying to make in general. And I think it's not until you reach like the legendary status where our society is deemed you like, okay, this is safe. People are okay to read your work. You're not controversial. You're not gonna piss anybody off. Okay, this is good. Where they actually care to touch upon those ideas. Um, so I wondered, in the creative process, was there anything where you were thinking about adding, but you didn't necessarily add, or a concept that you wanted to touch upon, but you censored yourself and then you later regretted it? Was that something that happened?
Um, no, I don't think so. I think if anything, it was probably the opposite. I think there's certain things obviously in the book. There's a lot of topics in the book. There's certain things that I pass over
Hmm.
because I figure most people are kind of only interested in hearing them or seeing them as like a skim through.
Hmm.
One of those things was race, IQ. Um, I felt like it was important to breeze through some of these topics because there's sort of an endless rabbit trail or rabbit hole that you can go down,
Hmm.
for things like race and IQ or even women, and gender dynamic.
Yeah,
So
of course.
there were things I probably harped on far too much. I think in retrospect, like it was it was even again tying back to the title. I think you're right about a lot of it being this is my perspective. This is what I believe to be true. I don't really care if you disagree, because if you disagree, then it's not for you. If you agree, then it is for you.
Yeah, of course.
Um, I think too, there was a lot of vulgarity in it, language in it. There were some funny things in it that I just wanted to include for the sake of being funny. There were some parable type things in there that spring from true experiences and true stories.
Hmm.
There was one called Doctor Woman, about a woman that becomes a nurse, becomes a doctor for the sake of becoming a doctor. But that whole story is true, um, and it's pretty tragic. I don't think I really censored myself too much. There was one chapter about alcoholism in there, or really just having substance abuse issues that I thought about removing, because it was a little bit personal. Because
Hmm.
I drank quite a lot in my 20s and my early 20s, and that caused me serious issues. Not legal issues, but it was just a stupid part of my life. And so writing that, I was like, I don't know if I want to put this out there. But like the first day that it was out and the books were going out, people were already messaging me about that chapter saying, wow, that was like my favorite one. And it really affected me deeply. And so that, as you said, if you create something, the the perspective is you would like it to be enjoyed, but it should be that you don't care if it's enjoyed, but it's a bonus that it is.
Yeah.
So it also goes into criticism of any kind, whether that's positive or negative. It's not for the criticism; it's for those it can affect, in a positive way.
Yeah.
and the rest, it's like not that important to me. But yeah, there's things about it that I would change in retrospect. There's things I wish maybe I would have elaborated a little bit more on, because maybe they seemed a little maybe too blunt, or maybe there weren't enough studies cited. There weren't any studies cited, I don't think, in the book.
They weren't peer reviewed enough.
No.
Yeah.
So I don't feel like I censored myself. If anything, I probably could have done that more and maybe used less swearing.
Yeah, dude.
Yeah. No,
But
they
regarding
weren't.
the, sorry, Jordan, I'll let you speak after this.
I was,
Regarding the, I lost my train of thought. Thank you, Jordan. Uh, I think in a lot of the cases where you actually point out the swearing and the profanity and whatnot, sometimes it does feel good to basically tell the people who the book isn't for, who wouldn't enjoy it, who wouldn't leave 5-star reviews on Goodreads, or who wouldn't be inspired by it in other ways, to go out and make their own work, or to have a new perspective on life, or to at least adopt or challenge these ideas. I think it's good to say to those people, like, go fuck yourself. Like
It feels good.
it feels good, because when even when a lot of Christians are conflicted and they're like, oh, but Jesus taught peace and equity and the whatnot, and then you read into the actual scripture and it says, I'm not here to bring peace but a sword, and he
Yes.
goes around and he flips tables, I believe it was, or they were illegally trading. So
Mm.
when you think about the history of Christianity as it being for the first 500 years practically like secret underground jihad against the Roman authorities, to instill their own religion upon the largest country in the world, and to actually spread the gospel and spread the word. I think when you look at it from a scriptural lens, whether it's beyond what we're accustomed to, the fact that we grew up in this culture and the fact that we take it for granted, and you dive deep into what the people truly want, I think there's not a single person in the world who is okay with the state that the modern world is. They just take very different perspectives on it. I think we address politics as the first part of this podcast because we wanted to make it clear that when a lot of these people say they aren't political, or when they say that they don't want to be political, even if they're on dissident fringes, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're disguising their views. A lot of the time, it's just you look upon the way that people argue these days, and it's just like, fuck this. I don't want to be a part of this. And when it comes to being an artist, you want to make sure that the demographic that you're, actually speaking to will actually at least accept what you're telling them, or at least challenge it on a basic level where they can actually think about this without outright dismissing it, which seems to be the trend that goes through. So I wouldn't say that profanity was a big issue. I'd say it's quite nice to tell those people to kick shit.
Mm.
Jordan, I'll let you speak on
I,
it right now. I
yeah,
need
I,
to ingest my daily diet of corn syrup because Klaus Schwab called me earlier and he said
Oh,
in a
that's
very
okay.
clear German accent that I need to drink more corn syrup because I'm
You
not
must
gay enough. I'm not gay
drink
enough,
the corn
so
syrup.
I'm not
Yeah,
gay.
yeah.
Yeah,
I
Jordan, go on, please. I need to mutilate
yeah.
myself.
Well, I was just gonna say, Jacob, if you check the Discord, Kaz, our good friend Kaz, like killing her, he's actually indicated that he'd be interested in joining right now.
Okay,
That's
sure.
fine
So
with me. Yeah.
I just want to let you guys know, because if he comes in and he interjects with something very abrupt, I don't want you guys to be particularly
Sure.
surprised.
Yeah.
So if he's in the waiting room, you should probably just let him in right now.
He's not in the
But
waiting room. I'll hit him up right now to join. But Jordan, touch
yeah,
in on your thoughts.
he's a great guy. I'm really he's our,
Awesome. Yeah.
our resident Canadian, and
What's his name again?
his
Kaz.
name's, but it's
Kaz. Okay.
a longer Polish name. We're actually fundamentally we're a gang of Polish nationalists, and we're
No,
I'm
we're
also
not. No,
Polish. So
are you?
yeah. Polish
wow.
and Sicilian, which the dissonant crowd gives me a lot of shit about, because
Yeah.
Sicilians are black.
Okay.
You can
Yeah,
edit
those
that.
guys,
I don't know. Yeah.
when it comes to look, I actually, when people ask me to provide my thoughts on from like ethnicity and ethno nationalism, obviously it's a very touchy and controversial subject. But what I always preface my thoughts by saying, look, if you look at for instance, the academic literature on this topic, I think the vast majority of it is flawed because they cling to the term ethno nationalism, and I don't think that the term ethno nationalism was necessarily flawed in and of itself, right? It is clear that that term actually does correspond to reality and to phenomenon processes that will unfold within reality, which I think is ultimately the ultimate test of the validity of any given concept, right? For instance, in the literature on psychology, there's this idea of construct validity, which basically tries to index any given constructs like, say, IQ or personality or these other more abstract variables to factors that can be actually empirically demonstrated to occur within reality itself. And that's how you, by measuring that degree of correspondence, you can actually begin to understand how accurate and how significant in a sense that construct is. And it's funny, that you mentioned IQ, because I don't want to turn this into one of the Charles Murray science of IQ type of podcasts, because that's not really, we don't really need to do that here and I don't really think that we even have the time to do that within the span of this podcast, because it's such a complex topic. But I think there are many misconceptions that float in contemporary discourse surrounding IQ. I do think that it is actually real and significant sense, and it's not just some type of linguistic construct or socially mediated abstraction. I do think it actually describes certain traits and patterns that we can observe in human behavior. I do think that there are differences in IQ among different populations, let alone individuals, and I think that those differences actually yield profound distinctions in how we come to interact with reality. Basically, there's this is going to expose me as someone who's just online too much. But I don't know if you guys have seen this meme. See, now we're entering into the free flowing stage of this podcast, which is what I'm actually interested in. But I was wondering if you guys have seen this meme that's been floating around on Twitter, in certain spaces of Twitter, of the divide between word cells and shape rotators. Have you guys seen that? Have you guys heard of that?
No, I can't say that.
No.
You guys, the word cell versus shape rotator. Okay, well, fuck, this is so. It's it's so nerdy and it's so weird, but actually it makes a lot of sense and it's really interesting to think about. But the idea is that basically, if you look at, and I know I'm rambling here, but I want to see what you guys have to think about this. I'm gonna tie it back to ethnicity, and then we'll obviously get back to more concrete matters.
Are the word cells the people who speak a lot?
Basically, the idea would be, in a sense, we inhabit the word cell world, Jacob and I, because we're podcasters. But basically, the idea is that if you give people, generally speaking, cognitive tests, like IQ tests, you find that they're actually different types of intelligence. And for the most part, they're positively correlated, right? So until a certain point, being good at, being proficient in one domain of thought is predictive of proficiency in the other domain. But then past a certain point, once you clear a certain threshold, they become orthogonal. And what that would mean in less complicated and less academic terms is basically as one form increases, the other essentially diminishes, or rather extremely heightened performance in one domain will not align with extremely heightened performance in the other domain. So there's a compromise in their trade-offs. And basically what you see in terms of the trade-offs is at one end you have people with very high verbal intelligence, and those people will be word cells. So someone like Jordan Peterson, Alexander Hamilton, actually, as an example, those would be influential figures that fall into this category. And on the other hand, you have people who are so-called, again, this is the meme, but it's shape rotators. So those would be people who have very strong spatial and mathematical skills, and that orients them towards very technical pursuits in life, like engineering, illustration, very, very obtuse hard sciences like rocket science.
Yeah. And I think a lot of those people tend to be autistic. Jordan,
I was just going to say the same thing. Yeah,
pretty much. Jordan, I was going to say that, I've literally heard about this concept and it is 100% true. But what I think, no, let me say this. I'll let you speak. I think what enshrining it in popular media does is then a lot of retards and retarded people, like clinically retarded people, tend to think, whoa, I must actually be a genius then, because just because I'm bad at like putting blocks together and like wiping my ass doesn't mean I can't be a genius in this, fucking anime fanfic adaptation that I'm writing. I'm literally going to be hailed as the new king of the online web, and I need to get these opinions out. And I think that's what Twitter does, is it alienates you in this little bubble where everyone thinks, well, I'm right. All of you guys are just stupid, because even though I'm not good at all these things, in this little bubble, I'm actually the best at this. So please, everyone, listen to me. And if you disagree with me, then you're insert pejorative here. Go on.
Yeah, but no, I completely agree with that. And it allows people who are actually confronted with various shortcomings and obstacles in their life and who don't really perform as well as they would like to in certain areas, right, to feel as if they have somehow been compensated for that by perhaps not necessarily God, right? Because many of these people actually tend to be atheists, but genetics, basically, or biological factors,
Yep.
which for actually become God in a sense. That's an idea that I play around with in some of my own work, which is to say that, like, this is a very Hegelian way of thinking about it, but if you look at ideas and how they basically transform over time throughout the course of human history, a certain idea can actually manifest itself in different ways throughout the different epochs and different periods of time. So it seems
We're
so.
getting into like phenotypes now and how people
Yeah,
with small jaws tend to think that they're like super
yeah,
interesting.
the creation of a concept like the physical universe or biology, genetic factors that didn't just exist in its own right as a means of obtaining some type of objective truth about the world, but it actually had a social content, a social function, which was to displace earlier forms of thinking about really the universe and our relation to it. And those earlier forms of thinking would be enshrined in the concept of God. So that concept was basically just displaced into the realm of matter, because in the modern secularist and atheistic conception of the universe, which is the physicalist conception, which I think we're all opposed to it, I would say, from what I can glean from this conversation, maybe in different ways, but we are generally opposed to it, and we think that it's quite destructive. I'd say that that's a key pillar, actually, of what we do in Scorpion Movement. That idea is, in a sense, or rather, it represents a transmutation of the idea of God into the secular scientific domain. Because if you think about it, the attributes are the same, basically, right? Matter is, in a sense, perceived of as being omnipotent, it's omnipresent, right? It fundamentally it delimits reality and it determines what we actually do, because you basically have to be a determinist if you're someone who thinks that the only thing that exists is the physical universe, because the physical universe operates on the basis of certain laws and processes that can actually map out, which means that even the possibility of human agency and human freedom in the meaningful sense is actually negated. So it's almost like, to tie that back to the meme, it's like that's what happens when shape rotators try to think about God. It's like the shape rotator bastardization of God and shit. I mean, that sounds really weird, but man,
That's a little above my. That's high. That's a higher IQ thought than I have.
I know it gets into some.
Well, no, it's even what you said about normies, right? So
yeah,
the term normie, it's like, well, normie according to what? So I know a lot of normies that have a lot more money than I do.
yeah. Well, I guess in that regard, the question would be, because this term is thrown around all the time in online spaces, and people never really take the time to interrogate what it actually means. What do you even think that a normie is? Like, do normies even exist, or is it just
Oh
something?
yeah, but again, it's more specific. I think, like, if you are
Yeah,
online, if you're in the dissonant space in Twitter, but you still use Reddit, you could be called a normie. If you're about organic food, but you don't know about raw milk, you could be called a normie. So it's like, um, I think, again, it's a pejorative term for anybody that doesn't agree with whatever the thing may be. Because, like,
yeah.
leftists will use that term now, like, oh, he's just a right wing normie. It's like, it's gotten too convoluted, so nobody really knows what that means anymore.
I think in a lot
Everybody
of
who's not
ways,
autistic is a
yeah.
normie. Yeah.
Yeah,
Also,
I
I think
think I think Jordan, let me touch on this just really quick. I think in a lot of ways, people who are like parts of these niche communities or niche ideologies tend to use that term to describe people who are just not in on the same thing as they are as much as they are. And you
the
find this to be used quite negatively in a lot of spaces where it's like people who are very like social justice oriented, like you're a normie because you don't know the fact that you haven't acknowledged the fact at the beginning of this podcast that you're airing this from the beginning, from the place of an oppressed people of a Native American land. You were supposed to acknowledge that at the beginning, and now
yeah.
you're a normie because you don't even understand these cross cultural concepts. I think what that does is it just kicks a lot of people out of the discussion. But objectively, like there is one like normie when you consider the fact that there's like if you divide society up into parts, then there's going to be that 80%, no matter
Yeah,
what it is, and that 80% is going to look and sound
yeah.
somehow similar.
I don't think that the idea of the normie is just some verbal construct that doesn't really exist in social reality. I do
Yeah, for
think that
sure.
there is a certain type of normie, or a certain type of person that could be something called a normie. But you know what my theory of the normie, basically, and I want to see what you guys have to think about this, and then maybe you could provide your own understanding of the concept, your own personal understanding. But to me, a normie isn't necessarily someone who follows a particular political ideology. I think that there are people who actually adhere to views that would at least ostensibly be revolutionary in nature. You know, some of the Antifa types, so-called ANCOMs, that could be considered normies in a sense. But to me, what a normie is more so it reflects a way of thinking about the world and a certain orientation towards the world that reflects a lack of critical thinking. You
Boomers, basically.
no, you know what I think it is? It's like it's not even the teacher's pets, but it's like the kids in school
Who
that
don't
never.
say anything.
No, it's not. Yeah, it's they don't say anything, and no. Well, they might say something, but it's never really that profound. But beyond that, more fundamental, it's they never really do anything beyond the domain of what is either A, expected of them by by the administration, by their parents, by society, or B, beyond what is just purely pleasurable. Like they're
Fuck
not.
yes, dude, that's perfect. Yeah, go on.
When I think about a normie, the reason that a normie might not know that much about philosophy, for instance, it's not necessarily because I think they have a lower IQ or some shit like
It's
that.
because it's not taught to them and not expected of them to know it, so they don't
Yeah,
bother.
yeah, it's like they just don't even have the personality that would enable them to get really interested in anything. Basically, you know what I'm saying? It's like
Yep.
have you encountered these types of people? Like it's not just that they don't question the narrative or question the script. It's like they're just not really that very interested in cultivating an inner world. It's like they're people oriented over idea oriented, kind
Well,
of. Does that,
this way you're just saying that like introverted autists are like geniuses, but I get
yeah,
what you're touching at. What you're touching at is a lot of these people who we would classify as normies really are just people that, in their minds, it's how to fit in above how to cultivate a personality for myself. And I
Yeah,
exactly.
think
that's
anybody
that's
of
what I
any
yeah.
affiliation, yeah, can be
I
that.
I think that's fear.
Yeah.
Normies are rich in fear. They don't want to stand out. They don't want to stick out. They want to fall in line. That would be probably the essential definition to me. Is just somebody who's governed and ruled by fear
Yeah.
of not
Yeah.
falling in line being, and that could be out of convenience, um, or just like a complete lack of ability to deal with conflict in any aspect of their lives. There's also just a complete lack of internal honesty with themselves, or there is no internal monologue that's happening. That could be that could be for any amount of reasons. I think a lot of that has to do with what people eat and what people drink
Oh,
and
absolutely.
what
Yeah. It's like
these
funny
the
you mention
senses.
nutrition is such a key theme, as I said, in Mike Mall's work, sorry, and in the works of many of the figures within these distant spaces more broadly.
Raw
Like
eggs, raw milk, raw meat.
probably excessively, but people like Bronze Age Pervert, Raw Egg Nationalist, these types of people, nutrition is actually a huge focus. So I was wondering
No,
maybe
but if I
uh,
can, sorry, I'm so sorry. I keep interrupting you because, but yeah, I
yeah,
wanted to touch on what Shazam said. I think like the polar opposite of that, of what you would characterize as a sort of type B person, is not really a person who stands out or is literate about a topic or anything. We can't quantify that, but someone who's just not afraid and even wants to be disliked by a small minority of people. Like
yeah,
there are people who are absolutely not normies just because they fucking love negative attention. There are
dude,
some people who just the people that think all press is good press typically tend to be on the fringes because it takes a special kind of character to say, you know what, fuck you, these ideas that I'm saying are not for you. You're never going to see eye to eye with me, so just sieve and cope and sit in the corner and cry about it. And
yeah,
I think no matter what you're doing, whether it's artistic or political, or if you're just, venting on a podcast or whatever, that's very helpful in making you like seem distinguished. So I was curious what you thought about that, Shazam.
yeah.
You're saying that people that want to be, I'm sorry. So you're
Uh,
saying that the normies are the people that
That are afraid of discourse, and then there are these fringes
yeah,
of people
yeah,
that,
well, that it's
yeah,
like just people that fall in line with anything. And it doesn't mean that you won't. I mean, again, it's like I was just talking to two guys the other day who both changed their citizenship status to what's called an American national because
yeah.
it basically takes you out. Do you know anything about that? There's a lot of
The
bullshit around it.
citizenship process or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
yeah. There's
Yeah, yeah, I know about it.
It goes back to UCC law, maritime law. It's a lot of conspiracy theory stuff that was probably first talked about in maybe mainstream by like Jordan Maxwell. Do you know that guy?
Yep. Yeah.
But he talks about aliens and shit. So I don't know. but they have done it legally. It's that's how they live, and they exist, and they don't pay taxes, and they can have any sort of automatic weapon that they want. Um, but this is all like, to them, anybody who's a citizen, like under the 14th Amendment, could be considered a normie as well. But
Mm-hmm.
again, it's I think going even further past that, it's like people that take vaccines, to me, are normies. People that vote could be considered normies. Like,
Absolutely, 100%.
it,
Yep.
I
but
agree.
it's like you have to have grace for those people. And so even going back to my book, like there's topics in there that I know nobody who's really a normie is going to read that book. Like,
Mm-hmm.
that's not who I wrote it for. But at the same time, within the sphere of people who are open to the ideas in that book, there are still topics like race and IQ
Mm-hmm.
where they still might have some sort of guilt within them where they can't explore that topic.
Mm-hmm.
Or raw meat, raw eggs, raw milk. Even
Yeah.
people that eat very healthily and very cleanly. Like, I was raised with good food, but it was organic food, and then we found out about non-GMO food, and it's like this constant process of nutrition. But even within that, it's like, oh, did you know you can eat these things raw? And did
Mm-hmm.
you know that pasteurization is bad, even if the milk is organic and pasteurized? So um, I think if you can open somebody's mind outside of the normie idea by just like one thing, oftentimes that will take them completely out of that situation. But again, I think it's an entire process that continues. So nutrition, for example, I think the reason that's such a huge part of dissident stuff, leaning stuff, is because people have completely neglected the idea that if a tiny little pill can have a really major effect on you, then the 3 square meals a day you're eating have an even larger one. It's logical. It's not revolutionary that what you're eating, you are what you eat. You know,
Yes.
this is like a retard's quote from,
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, like a peasant knew this,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
you know. Um, but it's not only that, but if you go further and further, then you maybe become a word cell about it, I guess. It's like,
Yeah, 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 yeah.
X, Y,
Deconstructing
yeah, it's like,
terminology. Yeah.
yeah. But again, like, to me, that all comes down to, it's like the pleasing of the five senses. It's the entertainment of the senses. So you're listening to pop music, you're watching television, you're eating GMO food, you're drinking fluoridated water,
Yeah.
you're, Bluetooth and 5G towers are going at all hours,
Mm-hmm.
no matter, it's
Yeah.
like this, it's this constant state of lulling people into this mentality where they can't hear from God, they can't commune with God because their own internal mechanism is so fucked, which
Yeah.
is your brain, because
It
your
does.
body affects your
I think
brain. I don't know.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I'd like to touch upon that quickly if I can, Jordan, then I'll pass it to you. So,
I,
the first thing that you said regarding to you, anyone that voting being a normie, I've noticed that since I've come to the UK for a little bit, and I've been here for quite a while, just a couple of months, a lot of people, well, this time around, I've been to the UK before, obviously, just not for this long, not particularly like much. But I've noticed that nearly everyone that is here, no matter what like ethnicity they are, whether they're English or Scottish, they tend to ask me, "Oh, you're American," and just pretend I'm doing a British accent here, but of what British. They tend to ask me, right, like, "Oh, who'd you vote for in this election?" And like, I didn't vote, and they're like, "Oh, so you aren't into politics a lot?" I'm like,
uh,
"No, it's just that when you're registered in Florida, it's not much that you can do with voting, regardless. And even then, you get to pick between two people who themselves are funded by much of the same groups, and
yeah.
people are betting and voting on all of it. So it's just like, to me, to mail in a ballot wasn't really one of my main priorities as a non-American national 14th Amendment citizen.
Well, then again, too, it's okay. So going past being a normie who doesn't vote, then you start questioning yourself because you're like, okay, well, I want to live in Florida
Yeah.
because it's a red state and because I can just hand you a gun and say, this is now your gun. Like, we don't need to register anything. Like,
Mm,
that's why you would want to live in Florida. You would want to live in Florida maybe for access to healthy and good food. The South is a little bit more difficult in that. It's
mhm,
actually funny. Like, growing up on the West Coast, a lot access to clean food, grass fed meat, raw milk. It's very easy there, but
mhm.
it's a blue coast. you know.
Yep.
And then, but then if you want to live somewhere where freedom reigns, it's it's the South,
Yeah,
which is
that's
all
what I've
red.
heard
So
from
it's
a
like,
lot of
well,
people.
yeah. So it's like,
A
I don't
trade-off.
know if it's a trade-off, but you know, I would rather live in Florida than, I don't know, fucking California right now.
Yeah,
Um,
especially as it's
so
burning. But yeah, some
Yeah.
other thoughts. Yeah, I did actually. Florida was never somewhere where I like necessarily moved. It was always somewhere that where my family was roughly from and situated. So it wasn't like a conscious choice. But in terms of voting, it definitely doesn't help, and definitely is a trade-off. So like from visiting the U.S., I've noticed a lot of these states have these things which I really fucking like, but then. Again, I talk to people who live there and they're like, get out of here, it is horrible. There are two other things. So I've noticed that um, actually, Jordan, I'll let you talk. I need
Yeah,
to
well,
formulate my thoughts.
I'm in a similar position because it wouldn't have even been possible for me to make the choice to move to Florida because I was born in Florida. I was born in Miami. That's actually the city in which I currently live, which as a university student. That's also where I met Jake.
Miami.
Yeah,
Yeah,
Miami.
yeah, yeah. Oh, to continue off on that,
And
one large thing, and I remember this. I'm so sorry, Jordan. Right now, I'm being a huge dick.
right,
Shazam, you talked about senses and stimulating the senses, and a lot of these concepts which you've explored, where what you eat affects, how you do every single day, and a single pill affects you so much, then why can't your entire diet? Like this is something that a medieval peasant retard would know. But I found that people largely who aren't into spirituality or shit like that, and not spirituality in the white girl way, like spirituality in general, like actually being religious and sticking to these principles, reading scripture, being in touch with who you are as a person, meditating, which I've been called gay for. Uh, a lot of these people think that these five senses don't really matter that much, but a concept that with me and Jordan explored in another podcast is once technology finds a way to overwrite the five senses that you have with Neuralink or internet connection or whatever, 5G
yeah,
chips, all this bullshit that people speculate about. Um, I find that it's very hard to distinguish reality from fiction because the only way that you know you're alive and the stuff around you is going on is because you can see, you can smell. I mean, if you were blind, your entire reality would be completely different because around 80 to like 90% of the world that you know would suddenly be gone, and that's just two of your eyes. There's a biological reason I think I've read why people have two eyes because the primary like animals and the motives or the whatever that had only one eye, the one eye would stop working and they just wouldn't breed and they would die off. So even if you think about it in like very
mm,
basic, like very super dialectic scientific evolutionary terms, there's a reason why humans would have two eyes, and also it just makes sense even if you're looking at it from like a holistic, what is called spiritual biblical lens according to scripture. But yeah, those five senses, once you overwrite them, or if you don't take care of them enough, or if you just live in filth and you drink corn syrup like I just did, or live in a truck and jerk off all day, and you don't really pay attention to yourself, you can stop smelling things, you can stop hearing things just as well. You can fall into addictions, and then you can lose grasp of those senses. Then you fail to recognize reality. So once this VR stuff really gets going, and once people really become into this technological unity, the world that they know can rapidly change because the
yeah.
senses are altered. So when you don't take care of what you eat, or the fucking smells that you smell each day, when you don't go on a walk, when you don't spend enough time in the sun, your entire world in reality begins to change because so does your brain. If your brain chemistry changes, you're going to see the world a whole different way. And I think that explains a lot of the schizo, attacks or whatever that you see throughout the news cycle. I think a lot of people tend to be mentally disturbed, not because of some underlying
Yeah.
psychological genetic condition. It's because they've led fucked up lives in fucked up environments, and it fucks them up in a very rudimentary way. So I was glad that you touched on that. Jordan, any thoughts?
So much to say in regards to what you just said. I want to touch on that idea actually of the seemingly random chaotic acts of violence that we see occur all the time in American society. Because I think people they never take the time to actually interrogate and investigate
The
exactly
news loves it. The news loves it, man.
why exactly it is that these types of events are occurring. You have all of these young men, many of whom actually are reasonably intelligent. If you look at a guy like, for instance, Adam Lanza, the Sandy Hook school shooter, that was not a dumb or unintelligent guy at all. he had obviously had a decent level of verbal intelligence, just judging by the YouTube videos that we've recovered of him speaking. And any other set of circumstances, he could have actually secured a decent life for himself. He could have even been a successful person. So why these otherwise either average or perhaps even slightly above average young men are basically just going out to public and performing these spree shootings, killing dozens, perhaps more than that, scores of innocent civilians with seemingly no ideological motives, so they're not really terrorists. Oftentimes, it's difficult to detect even a personal motive. We look at that and we're disgusted and horrified by the actual events themselves, and rightfully so, of course. I mean, they are horrifying. To just slaughter innocent people in the streets is among the most horrifying.
Autism, loneliness, and eating shit
Yeah,
can really fuck you up, is what I'm thinking about.
but,
It's a
but we
deadly
never
combination.
people don't really investigate why exactly it is that we seem to be very unique. And when I say me, I'm referring to America, to American society, to our country, really. Why we seem to be very distinct in disregard of exhibiting and being plagued by this phenomenon. And I do think that it has you know what I think it has something to do with. If you want, you guys can riff on this phenomenon of random acts of violence and the school shootings and the general chaos of American society. But this type of violence is fundamentally distinct from, for instance, gang violence. The gang violence that's happening in inner cities where people are just shooting each other up in the streets as a result of some type of turf war or drug deal gone wrong. This type of violence is fundamentally distinct from
It's
that.
different. It's distinct from war.
Yeah, it's
What
even
a
distinct.
nice analogy
It's
to riff on.
it's hard. It's actually much harder to analyze. I think that's part of why it's distinct from those other phenomena, right? Because it's not too difficult to understand why a war happens, right? There are ideological factors or economic factors. One faction wants to gain a certain degree of resources, right? So on and so forth. And actually, similar factors manifest in the case of these turf wars I see in cities like Detroit, Chicago, so on and so forth. But when you look at school shootings and these mass shootings in general, yeah, you have some ideological killers like the Christchurch shooter, the shooter of that supermarket in Buffalo, and so on and so forth. But there does appear to be this element of randomness, of chaos, of unpredictability. And I think we actually have a responsibility to investigate why that's happening. And I think that there are several factors that explain why this could be the case. One of those is what Jacob mentioned, and I wanted to riff on this for a bit actually. That idea of hyperreality, right? Remember we've talked about Baudrillard, the theorist in the past who had this idea and
Yep.
wrote Black Reconciliation. But the idea is that basically in the contemporary world, there's this proliferation of replications and simulations of reality that occurs to such an extent that it drowns out reality itself, such that you can actually go through the entirety of life through solely mediated forms of experience, right?
Yep.
You can,
And we're also actually not talking in person
yeah,
right now. Our brains think we are, but we're in completely separate parts of the world.
you can go through life solely on the basis of these mediated experiences. So now, this wouldn't have been the case hundreds of years ago, right? Okay, if you were what an incel would be like today or something, right? Like a guy who's having trouble with girls and who desires romantic affection, you could have acquired a prostitute back in the day, but at least, and that
You
would have
could
been,
still do that, mate.
yeah, well, you can still do that now, but that would have been the main outlet, right? And it's still pathetic in a way, but at least it's actually real and it's physical. But nowadays, these guys
Oh
don't even
yeah, no, I get what you're saying. Yeah, go on.
they can basically just be clooners, for lack of a better term.
Yep.
You can jack off to porn all day. You don't really that's how you can fulfill your sexual urges. You don't really have to go outside and talk to a real woman. And if you want to take it to the next level, you can actually just I know it's really sick, but you can get a VR and AI girlfriend. Like there
Yeah.
are guys who are out there doing this. I just thought this sounds so pathetic, but
Yeah, and what about the British guy that made billions of dollars off of founding
yeah.
like OnlyFans and taking 5% of all of these men that were giving these women money?
Oh,
I mean, you
look,
think about it in a very like rudimentary sense, and a lot of what we knew in the past is now being replaced by this. And the left blames it on capitalism, and the right blames it on degeneracy. But really, as Shazam said, it's a circle. It all roots back to the same issue, like
like
original sin and whatnot.
I wouldn't really describe
It's being
left
exploited.
in a sense, capitalism does actually incentivize those degeneracy on a mass
Yeah.
scale society. But basically, what's happening is if you look at, for instance, the recent headlines, they're actually these tech companies are actually somewhat optimistic. These tech CEOs are actually happy that more and more people are going to be immersed into this hyper reality to the extent that some of the guys that you might know, like the more not the nerdy, but the more incel kind of weird, weeby type of guys, they might just basically disappear from life as we know it. Like you'll never see them again
It's
because they're just
happening in Japan. They have the whole
yeah,
like phenomenon of the men like shutting themselves down.
into the fucking metaverse. They're gonna have the headset on, and they'll be able to experience basically infinite pleasure. And that is something I think that should horrify us on the most fundamental and spiritual levels. And it is also, to tie this back to Christianity, I think that's almost the epitome of Luciferianism. Because about what the Bible says about the nature of Satan and Lucifer and demonic activity, they fundamentally entail a subordination of being itself and of the actual being of the human to an end that is not actually contained within the being itself, right?
At least in Sodom and Gomorrah, they weren't eating bugs,
That's
right?
the idea of bondage and slavery, and that's why the Bible, in a sense, condemns usury and it condemns debt and it condemns. I would say that even condemns.
I'm not gay enough yet anymore.
like like landlords. When you engage in those types of relations, you're not actually participating in activity for the sake of activity. This is like exactly what Jacob said about art. You're doing it for an ulterior purpose that isn't contained within the activity. So, and to me, that is against freedom, and that's fundamentally demonic. And that's why I think that pornography, or the success of pornography, these types of digitally mediated sexual appearances, I think that they are fundamentally demonic because they allow you to really be you. They don't allow you to be a human. They reduce you to this animalistic existence. And the saddest part of that to me is that no one's really doing anything to stop this. Like no politicians ever talk about this. No people who actually exercise any degree of power, influence in society, or interest in doing anything to stop this, because we basically live in a world that is dominated by these powerful tech entities and like the tech overlords. I know it's such a cliche term, like that we live in a society in 1984 shit. It's actually a lot worse than 1984 because they control you through the guise of freedom itself. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Remember the idea of freedom of choice, basically. But when enacting in such a manner, you think that you're free, but you're actually under a form of slavery and bondage in a sense, because you're just subordinating yourself to these physiological animalistic processes, basically, the pursuit of pleasure. And there's something really demonic and sick about that to me. And no one really does anything to stop it. These tech entities are they're very satanic people. They're concerned fundamentally with the acquisition of profit above all else. So they're actually happy about this. Like I said, I read an article recently that was almost cheering on and championing this process. It was championing the idea of AI and VR girlfriends, where guys who are lonely and who are in need of some type of romantic validation just they go to ChatGPT and these other chatbots, and they basically talk dirty to these little robots, and it's just really fucked up to me. And I think in the past, religion and Christianity would have always provided a bulwark against something like this. It would have ensured that something like this doesn't happen, that the human element is preserved. But like I said earlier, that was displaced by scientific knowledge after the Enlightenment. And
people frown upon Christianity so much these days as well. Like I've noticed that particularly in developed countries, like first world countries, most of them, like if a kid is like a church kid and he like has a cross and he prays the rosary and he carries a Bible, they're like, okay, he's a little bit of a freak. That's so weird. I'm gonna go back to my room. I'm gonna jerk off to BDSM porn because I'm not weird like him.
Yeah, it's becoming increasingly acceptable to denigrate really any forms of religious expression, particularly
Absolutely. Except for Islam. You can't criticize Islam because then you know what happens.
Yeah.
But if Christianity is a weak target, you can go for it.
Yeah. And like I said, that's a problem to me because, as I said earlier,
because they're pacifist, right? So we can riff on them.
Religion
That's the mentality that's common.
Religion would have prevented something like this from taking hold in society because it recognizes, at least Christianity does in Christian theology and Scripture, it recognizes the dignity of the human being because the human being is crafted in God's image. And so the human being actually has a telos or a purpose in this Aristotelian sense. We're not just reducible to clumps of atoms or bags of meat. And I think that is actually a shift really in metaphysics and in the way that we think about the universe that produces these types of societal crises that we're seeing today, like porn addiction, this weird hyper-reality shit.
That sounds very Ron Hubbard Scientology.
Yeah, so what do you guys think about that? I know it's really dense, but it's this interesting nexus of ideas that I've been thinking about recently. So, yeah.
Again, like I break things down very simply. For me, it's like Christianity is it's not easy, but it's actually a lot simpler than most people make it.
Yeah.
I think what you're talking about with unity, it's like Christianity really offers unity. It says you know, within Christianity, essentially, there is no Jew, no Gentile, no
Yeah.
barbarian, no Scythian, no bond nor free, but Christ is all and in all. So that's like, to me, anything created by man at its root is flawed, will be flawed, and will look completely different. So this is a gripe that I have with Catholicism, because Catholics often talk
Go
about
on,
how
go
Wait,
on.
but you
Catholics
are,
off
As a proud Catholic, I'm proud to
are,
listen to this. Jordan, let him
are
speak.
you?
Interested. Go on.
Well, Catholics often talk about the unity of the Catholic Church, that they've
Mhm.
never changed. Their doctrine has remained consistent.
Not true.
I don't believe that it has. You know,
Mhm.
as far as all the research that I've done, it hasn't. There is
Mhm.
a schism in Catholic churches, just like there's schisms in whatever evangelicals, Protestants, whatever you want to call them.
Absolutely, yeah.
Um, Even within the church that I was raised in, what my dad led it. It's like there's things I look back on now where I know this was incorrect. I know it was guilt manipulation. I think my parents were great people. My dad, in his own right, was very revolutionary when it came to the way that he led a church and the way
Mhm.
that we did what church was.
Yeah.
And it offended a lot of people and drove a lot of people away, because it was more of a fight for what is real and what is really important. Um, I wrote this in my book. It's like a lot of the war that we're in, or the battle that we're in, is for the real, is
Mhm.
for the true, is for the beautiful. Um, the irony of that is, like, the realest thing to me in the world is spirituality, God, and my connection to God, my relationship with God. That's the realest thing, like, in my life, that I always can go back to. But that's the thing that nobody can see, as well. So in my truth and conviction, it's literally something that somebody cannot see.
Mhm.
Um, on the flip side of that, for other people, like you're saying, this pursuit of pleasure, infinite pursuit of pleasure is like, it even goes back to that Tolkien. It's like a Tolkien quote in Lord of the Rings or something, where it's like the shadow can't create, it can only warp or flip upside down. So
yeah, yeah.
even all of these things that these people are pursuing, um, are really counterfeit everything. So it's not real water. It's not real food. It's not real sex. It's not real entertainment. It's not even real music or real books, or
Yeah.
it's all filtered through this thing that who wants, and that's,
Mhm.
I think that it's the question of politics. It's like, well, yeah, of course they're going to be happy about this. Whether
Mhm.
you look at it from a perspective like the Georgia Guidestones, where it's like, we want to get the population down to this.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, like, stop people breeding, stop people
Mhm.
having children, stop doing what God told them to do in the first place. Multiply.
Mhm.
You know,
Yeah.
your job as a man is to have a wife and have children and raise your family. And really, when it comes down to it, like, I've stopped even freeing myself from the political realm, especially, has been about, okay, it's not my job to solve what's fucking happening in California. It's not
Mhm.
my job to solve what's happening in the election cycle.
Mhm.
Like, it's my job to affect those around me personally that are in my sphere
Of
of
course.
influence. And what you're talking about with Jordan, sorry, I keep
Yeah.
reading your name and I want to pronounce it as Murad, but Jordan, you were
Yeah.
talking about the dissonant spaces.
Yeah.
Um, it's amazing because I think, I don't know who created the internet. I haven't looked into this, like, where it comes from. Shit.
Tim Berners-Lee.
Well, there you go. So,
Yeah.
but either way, I assume that it was created by people that wanted to somewhat be decentralized and
Yep.
create a space that was free. Um, and then obviously it's been corrupted to the point where it's the flow of thought, but it's almost had the backward. Um, it's resulted in something that's completely opposite of what mainstream wants.
Yeah.
So, like, two of the people that I met in dissident right spaces, I've done one guy's audiobook. Another has given me a lot of really great diet and fitness advice. Like, both of those people came to my wedding.
Oh
Like,
wow. That's
but I met them online, and obviously you should be careful about who you get in
yeah.
contact with and hang out with and shit. But it's like, you find people of like mind and of like spirit in those types of spaces. And so it's like, well, I hate the internet in a lot of ways. I wish it was shut down in some ways, but it's also a great resource for things like finding midwives and people that can actually talk to you about good health and diet advice. And it's like, my wife, we balanced her hormones through somebody I met online, and it cured her of a lot of different stuff that she was dealing with internally in her body. These are just people that you meet in these kinds of spaces. So dissonant is just like, well, Jesus was dissonant. He wasn't resonating with either side. I feel like I've lost the plot of what the fuck we were talking about, but either way, these people that are doing this or will live in the VR world with like the sucky machine on their wiener all day, like these people are the normie people.
Yeah.
Like that's like Luciferianism is normie. It's like the furthest it goes is that's Luciferianism.
It's like the logical conclusion of the normie way of interacting with the world. Basically.
Yeah. And so the fight really is what is real. And once you've decided and come to the conclusion about what is real, then that's your fight. To me, it's God, his kingdom, building that first, concentrating on what he wants me to do, what my purpose is. And not doing that is what will drive you insane. And worrying about solving it. It's like you're talking about biblically. Well, it's in the Bible that shit is not supposed to get better. It's not going to get better.
Yeah.
He never said it's going to get better, like ever.
Yeah, well, I think biblical scripture and Christian theology actually.
Jordan, you're like, I can see the side of you. You're like,
I have to charge my phone, so I have to flip the phone.
Okay, I'll just do this while I'm listening to you. Is that fine? Okay, go.
Let me flip it around, but I have to hold it. Okay.
I'm being so tough on you. I'm so sorry, dude. I don't.
Yeah, you're ripping on him hard, dude.
It's fine.
Yeah. I've been like brutalizing him for the entirety.
It's not.
It's not usually like this. Trust me. Go on.
It doesn't bother me. It's not significant. It's trivial. But in regards to the idea of progress, right? Well, I'd say that generally speaking, biblical scripture and Christian theology are actually very skeptical of the idea of progress, of that uniquely liberal conception of history, which is really the Kantian conception, which says that man begins in this very uncivilized and irrational state and progresses to a higher and more elevated form, essentially. And it's that progression that actually constitutes really the structure and the meaning of history. I think, if anything, and Jacob, you probably have a lot to say about this, because we're the founders of this movement, but it seems to me to be the case that the deconstruction of that idea, which basically everyone takes for granted, that the world is becoming a better place over time, that violence is going down, that very normie Steven Pinker lipshit type of attitude, the deconstruction of that conception of history and social progress is probably one of the key aims and one of the key underpinning themes of really what we do in Scorpion Movement. Like, even if you go back to our first podcast when we weren't really as knowledgeable as we are now,
2 years ago,
eloquent as we are now, you can still see the seeds of that idea. And it seems like it interconnects basically almost everything that we've done and that we've talked to. So I was wondering what you guys think about that, the different conceptions of history maybe and how they give way to the world that we actually live in today. I think
I love to set out footwork, but go on, finish.
Yeah, so in conclusion, really, obviously this is a complex topic and we could really go on about this for hours, but to me, one of the main problems as well of the contemporary world that actually produces and aligns with the other crises that we mentioned, like this over-sexualization, overstimulation, this lack of meaning and struggle, right, is that we naturalize history and we almost treat it as if it's this biological organism in which we are inevitably and inexorably enmeshed, such that history actually dominates man rather than the other way around. And so as a result of that, we think that the contemporary order or the contemporary state of affairs in which we live is basically inevitable or it's necessary. It was historically necessary, not contingent. It's that fallacy of reification, where you treat an abstract entity as if it's something concrete. And I think to presuppose that all the time, just in everyday life and in everyday discourse, no one will ever really question, for instance, the structures of finance capital or money or debt or Wall Street, or the idea that we need to just bail out these big banks whenever they make decisions they actually went about doing with a certain degree of intentionality, decisions that were actually their fault. No one will ever really question that. And I think that's because of this fallacy that just floats around in everyone's head surrounding of history. And to me, what's so interesting is that it seems that liberalism itself presupposes the idea of history as a biological entity.
Yeah, could I touch on that?
It can't really exist without that. And I feel like our task actually, as creatives in a sense, and just as dissidents, is to deconstruct that idea and to show that no, things aren't necessary. Like they're not. That's actually a demonic idea because it subordinates us to external forces. We have control. Like, we're humans. We shape the world in which we live.
Well, history is a stupid concept because it's God's will. Leave it to
Yeah,
God,
yeah.
bro.
I think
But
history is the
I
key.
I yeah, I did want to touch on what Shazam was saying though. So
Yeah.
first he said about his dad being a pastor. Well,
Oh yeah.
even if our parents don't mean to twist things one way or another, or even if they make mistakes because they themselves are flawed people and they have original sin and they may not convey the same ideas that they're trying to, at least your dad was an MLK. Okay, so let's get this out of the way on this occasion. He could have made plenty of more mistakes, right? But yeah. I wanted to touch on the fact that live music, I think, is one of the things that saves people. I don't know why. I just have a feeling like the fact that people come across together from like different spectrums and different places in the world, even if it's something like completely normie and mainstream, the fact that people are still dedicated to seeing an artist or a band live rather than listening to them on. No, we don't even have vinyls anymore unless you're a collector who likes to waste his money on the streaming platforms or whatever. The fact that people actually come across and they recognize the value in these communities in real life is really reassuring. I wanted to touch on
Yeah.
the food thing last because
Yeah.
Jordan, me and you met in Miami. So I remember when I was living for a bit in Miami. I'm sure you remember there was this vegan food store that was near me, and I remember I once came in there and there was a lady at the front with like pins and like colored hair, and I said to her, "Hey." Um, do you think there's any like vegan food that I could use to put on my cheeseburger with like the raw milk that I'll be drinking? And she told me like, get out. I thought that like that culture has already spread to Miami where people look for a lot of substitutes and not a lot of them are like original. I feel like as a society we tend to deprioritize like the original things, the things that we're used to, whether it be the religion or whether it be the traditional way of like making food or just a traditional way of spending time. I think in the eyes of most people that have been open, have a high like big five trait of openness. Um, there's so much more exciting things for them to do that, in contrast, the normal way of doing things, like being normal, has in itself become uh, pejoratively stupid and retarded to them.
Yeah.
Because it's just like you know the way that people are when they're in high school. It's just like my cousin Greg does cocaine in his fucking van. I want to be like Greg. I don't want to do the stupid. I don't want to do my fucking homework or go to church, mom. I want to do what Greg does. You
Yeah.
know,
Yeah.
like
Well,
like you tend to go in a whirl, and once all these doors are open to you, it seems that the traditional or the mainstream way of doing things rapidly falls apart. And
yeah. Well, we've all met people.
I'm sure you were touching in on that too, so I'll let you speak.
Yeah. There's, I feel like we're overloading Shazam here with just random schizo rants and ideas, but it's fun. I mean, that's what we do on this
No,
podcast.
no, I really love it. You guys are totally fine.
Yeah. I mean, Shazam, I guess if you wanted to
I was
riff
gonna
off.
say it would be unfortunate if it was someone like a professor and they would be just sitting here while I'm pretending to snort cocaine. So please go on.
Yeah.
No, I think I'm not really sure exactly what you were trying to convey there, but I think you know you can raise a kid as well as you can, and then original
Of course,
sin. And so like you will never not make a mistake. I will never not make a mistake.
it takes over.
Um, yeah, with kids that I have as well. So again, that's the foundation. It's like because I was raised with the foundation that I had, even when I went off into the fool's land,
Yeah.
it was still I still had the roots. I still had the foundation. That's a proverb. It's like raise up a child way he should go. When he grows
Yeah.
old, he will not depart from this. So it's yeah, and that to me again is like how you change things. Now you're not going to change them in the grand scheme of things. I think that's black pilled a lot, and I know that's probably a cringe term now too. I don't
No,
care.
I was going to bring up the term
It's
blue
like
pilled when we were talking about normies as well, seeing as that's
it's
what
not a
I'm
black. It's
noticing.
not like a
Yeah.
depressing thing to me. It's very much encouraging. Is like I already know what the ending is going to be. I already know what the process. I don't know exactly what the process is going to be, but I know what the process is going to be.
Mhm.
Um, I'm not sure all of the steps and iterations and years it will take to get there, but I'm already confident of what the end has in store. And so just knowing that to me is very, very encouraging. A lot of people, especially in dissident community, are like, well, we want to go back to fucking Rome, and we want to go back to the 1950s, and we want to go back to these time periods when they imagined things were somehow better. And I'm very, very happy to be living here and now and being able to see these things and have these types of conversations, which would have been impossible. As you said, it's like we think that we're in the same room talking, but it's just like it says, you know, where two or three are gathered together, there I am in their midst. So it's, I think, I think the dissonant stuff has been amazing just because of the relationships that I've had, the conversations that I've been able to have with people that I would never have otherwise met.
Yeah.
And I think so in a weird way, God is always taking things that man intends and designs to be evil and still will use them to his will, to his good. Even even politicians.
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah. So I love history, though. It sucks because the more I learn about history, the more it's hard for me to believe so much of it. But I love reading it. Like I'm reading a Civil War trilogy by Shelby Foote. It's awesome. But at the end of the day, too, I'm like, well, how much of this is true? How much of this really happened? How much has just been kind of told to us? And then you were talking about how, I don't know if this is what you were saying, but there's a book that I read a long time ago by Francis Fukuyama. And it was called the End of History, The Last Man.
Yeah, we're very familiar.
At first, sorry?
I was just saying, we've talked about that book extensively on the podcast.
I think we did a podcast about it. Yeah.
Yeah,
he's such a he's a normie, but he's got some really great shit to say. I'm sorry.
I was going to say not to interrupt, but to me, he's a normie because he thinks that the end of history and this arrival of a post-historical world is a positive phenomenon. Like he cheers it on in the book for the most part.
Yeah, and my thought was that he would be very, very wrong about what he was talking about when I read this. I think it was like 2016, 17. But as you're talking about history now, it feels very much like we've already kind of arrived at that point, and it's like things are now just kind of memory hold over and over again. Yeah, it's like I think about since 9/11, it's like what really has happened. Like so much shit has happened that you'll never ever hear about again, really. And so you just cherry pick these like events, and that becomes history. And so it starts to really throw 200 years or 300 years of history or 1,000 years of history into sort of this.
I think
how much of this do I buy?
Yeah, you know? I think man tries to go against the current too much, especially when you speak in terms of scripture and there being like one single will that humanity follows regardless of whether it wants to or not. I think we've become obsessed with this of being different, and I think that's what makes a lot of people not different. I'm not sure if this is like, I'm not sure if I'm making myself clear, but either way, that's just a thought I had.
Yeah. Wait, Jacob, could I just ask one question for Shazam? Because you mentioned history. Well, to me, history is I've been fascinated with history for as long as for as long as I can remember. But the manner in which I expressed that interest over time changed, I'd say. Because when I was really young, when I was a little kid, I was interested in the micro level, like very granular details of history. So different leaders, wars, battles. I would read biographies of dictators and tyrants because I was just really interested in warfare and violence. It's kind of a weird choice of subject matter for a little kid to be interested in, but whatever. Regardless of that, though, over time, I became more interested in actual theories of history. What history actually is, how it's possible for us to study it, the weird paradoxes of history, such as, for instance, the fact that, in a sense, whenever we even speak of history, we actually negate the possibility of history itself because we bring the past into the domain of the present. And so it's weird that even the fact that we can speak of history poses a bit of a problem for us, right? And that ties into what I was saying earlier with that idea of the naturalization of history and how that idea is fundamentally demonic and how it actually causes contemporary societal problems because it makes us think as if the current state of affairs was necessary, that it just had to arise rather than being the result of contingent processes that were actually decided on by humans and by human agency through collective organization, through social groups, right? But what I want to ask of you then is, first of all, what do you think of, again, that idea that history falls within a grand, or basically any idea that history falls within a grand narrative? that it's not just a sequence of random processes and events, but that it actually follows a certain structure and is and perhaps even bends towards a certain end, and that you can actually map out that structure to basically arrive at the realization of the meaning of history and what history is. Because before I allow you to respond, I'll just preface this by saying that, when I was a child, and I think many people nowadays, many Zoomers and young millennials actually can relate to this because they've gone through similar experiences. What happens when you first get on the internet, when you go to Reddit, Twitter, 4chan, more fringe spaces online, is you're immediately exposed to politics and specifically the ideology. Like Jacob, we've talked about this with Charlie Looker. One of the most interesting phenomena of the 21st century is that ideologies and political ideologies actually now serve really as identities for kids, basically, for kids and teens. They do what, for instance, musical subcultures like scene kids or goths or emos did in the past, basically, for teens. They provide a sense of community and belonging.
Yeah, and
And
that's so fucking weird in some ways.
so but it's so trippy. Like, remember Charlie Looker was telling us about. He was saying, "Don't be that one kid who has anarcho-communist in the bio and then switches to alt and is a monarchist." It's just don't do that. But even the fact that that does happen on such a large scale is really interesting to me. And how that relates to what I'm talking about here is, I was basically a Marxist or a communist when I was 13, and it's largely because I was exposed to those types of ideals by people on the Chapo Trap Out subreddit. And if you guys remember that shit, it's kind of a
Of
weird
course.
fucking era, but those types of people convinced me that that was the right doctrine, that doctrine had the answers for really how to live life in a sense, not just how to correct contemporary injustices. And even though I still am fairly anti-capitalistic in my outlook, I'm still quite skeptical of private property and private ownership. I think we can move beyond that to arrive at a better system. I actually rejected Marxism probably a couple of years ago because I had a problem with the idea of a grand narrative of history, right? In Marxism, that would be dialectical materialism, but that idea is just limited to Marxism. I had a problem with that because there seems to be something fundamentally anti-human and even demonic about that, because it negates even the possibility of human agency and freedom. And so I was just wondering, what do you think of narratives of history, grand narratives, whether they be the narratives that Fukuyama talks about, right? That linear conception that things are just always getting better until we reach this weird end state where history stops. Maybe the opposite of that, some type of negative, pessimistic conception. Just what do you think of those types of ideas? Like, do you think that they're dangerous or that they're interesting? What do you think of that, really? I know it's a broad.
Yeah, no, I think it's a little bit of both. I think it can be a dangerous rabbit hole. As I said before, it's like how many questions. It's like, this is the problem I have with Jordan Peterson. One of the main problems I have with him is he's too open. His mind is an open grave.
Yeah, I agree with you.
Or Joe Rogan, your mind is fucking too open. Like, it's fun to talk about all of these things. If it fundamentally changes your conviction about who you are, what your purpose is, that's a problem. For me, these kinds of questions and conversations are fun because I can talk about something where I don't necessarily even agree with it, believe in it. It's like a flat earth discussion. Whatever your beliefs on that would be, it's interesting to me. I think there's some random and very strange coincidences around it. But at the end of the day, whether it's flat or round or square doesn't really change my perspective on who's in control of it. So it could be round. We could be going around the sun. The sun could be going around us. It doesn't really matter to me. As far as history, again, like I said, if you know the ending, you know it's going to get worse. So the narrative of history is that it's getting worse. It seems like it's getting better, according to maybe Fukuyama or somebody like that. But as you're saying, AI, jack off machines, VR,
Joe, the design, genetic engineering.
Yeah, glyphosate, fluoride, vaccines, etc. These are not good things. So in that sense, it's like, well, history has been one long march to sedating humanity, deleting humanity. Maybe I'm not even sure what that means.
Yeah,
like all the way. Obviously, you can't delete it completely, but they want to very much destroy a lot of it. But I really like as you were saying, microhistory. So I'm reading about the Civil War.
Yeah, micro.
It's cool because the whole purpose of the Civil War for so many people is just one overarching subject. It's MLK. It's like, well, slavery. That's it. But then if you go into the reasons behind it, who was starting it, and it's fascinating. The characters that were involved are fascinating because they don't even have the same motives as maybe the people that were behind this. But then I always look at what you got out of it. So again, Civil War, you get out of it taxable population. You get out of it the 14th Amendment, which turns us all basically into slaves, because that's what they gave the freed slaves in order to
Yeah,
make
yeah,
them citizens. So they to pass the 14th Amendment
yeah,
so that all of us would fall under that.
yeah,
World War One, well, you get the League of Nations, and you subdue nationalism. World War Two, you get the establishment of the State of Israel, and you get the United Nations. Um, so all of these things, it's whether you look at them as this was a tailored, purposeful reality or not, it's still moving in the direction that I believe God is orchestrating. Whether he wishes that upon us is one thing. I don't think that he wants those who serve him to suffer that greatly. Like, I don't think he wants us to die. But at the end of the day, that is what is going to happen. I don't really believe he wishes persecution on us, but he tells us that it's going to happen. So it's like, yeah, I think things like Mud Flood, for instance, or
yeah,
Old World, that kind of stuff is very interesting to look into. If it changes your foundation or shakes your foundation or puts it upon the sand, then I don't think it's healthy for you. If it's fun to talk about and it's interesting and it gives you maybe a greater explanation of what's already true, then that's awesome. It's like flat earth. Like, well, it says that the earth is set on its foundations, cannot be moved. It talks about the four corners of the earth. So what is that? That can't be a sphere. But does it fucking matter? Not really. Um, Old world stuff is interesting. The World's Fair, um, architecture in general. You know, why have we lost technology to build certain things? Why were certain things built in the first place? All of that stuff's really, really cool and fascinating to me. But at the end of the day,
yeah. You don't.
my conviction is like iron. Like, it just doesn't,
Yeah,
it doesn't need to shift. And what's more, if you find that, then everything wraps into that. It's not like you have to wrap your belief system around it. It's like, well, does this fit um, into what I believe to be true? No, to be true.
yeah. I agree.
Um,
That's interesting. Yeah.
yeah,
So you would say then that, well, first of all, I think we can all agree that it's a terrible idea to get lost in the web of intellectual masturbation, basically, especially when it has no actual concrete effect on not only your life, but anyone else's lives, the lives of the people that you care about, right? There's obviously a danger in that. And I pretty think there's a certain type of person, yeah, maybe these word cell types that populate the internet and that tend to actually accrue a very significant following presence on the internet that tends to fall into these traps of confusing the contents of their words with what actually exists in reality. And that's basically how the schizo is formed. Like, therein lies the origins of the schizo archetype, the schizophrenic, basically, who's just rambling on in these with these very grand abstract theories that don't have any relevance to people's lives. There's a problem in that. So I think we can all agree on that as a starting point. But the build off of that, for what I got from your mini speech here, from your ideas here, it's
Mini
not
speech.
no, not to. I just don't know the best term for it. Not. I'm not saying that that's bad. I'm not trying to denigrate it. It was really interesting.
no,
But
no, no, you're fine.
from it is that
Monologue is better. Come on.
you're generally critical of those types of grand narratives about history and the meaning of history, but at the same time, you do think, from this again, this is my interpretation. This is what I got from your words. You do think that God, in a sense, does have an actual divine plan for humanity. Correct. That is
Oh
what.
yeah, yeah, absolutely.
So do you think that that plan actually manifests itself in basically in history, in the way in which humanity evolves over time?
Yeah, I think that about it's funny though because
Yeah.
sorry, and I don't want to go on another crazy tangent, but I think about this like Germany World War II thing where it's like you have this. It's almost like you end up rooting for the villain within either stories or with history, whether he is or isn't really important. But you start taking on this. Maybe he was right about these things. Maybe it would have been better had he won this or come out on top in this situation.
Yeah.
Um, but then if I believe that God has that narrative, it's like, well, was it that this person was actually genuinely evil, or was the world just meant to go in this direction. It's kind of like the Tower of Babel. Well,
Yeah.
unity, everybody was working together for a common goal. What was that common goal? Well, it's basically to supplant God.
Yeah.
So it's like, well, in our minds, maybe unity is great. In our minds, maybe, togetherness is great. And then, so why would he mess that up? Well, it's not great according to him. I'm trying to stay on topic for you.
So, but basically, you think that in a sense, God actually sets in motion history itself, basically, like history on.
Yeah, I think so, but we also have free will and
Yeah.
freedom of choice. To we choose destiny. We manifest
Yeah.
the world and the life in which we live. I definitely think there are people that are at work behind these things. I don't think the
Of course.
president is doing shit. Like,
Yeah.
and in a lot of ways, what you're talking about with capitalism, as much as I like money and making money, things like that, I don't think money is evil. I think the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. But it's like it also says, he who does not leave an inheritance for his family shall be accursed. I'm misquoting that scripture, Jacob. So
You're good.
yeah, it's like something along those lines. It's like if somebody doesn't provide for those of his household, especially of his own family, let him be accursed, something like that.
Hmm.
So what you're talking about with capitalism, like most of this all does come back to money.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
The pursuit of
even war, it's like, well, war would not exist if it wasn't about resource. It just wouldn't. Um, if you didn't have something to fight over, then you wouldn't be fighting. So it is money, it is financial.
yeah.
But no, I do believe God has a divine plan. Whether he sets in, I think he sets everything basically in motion. He's around and controls time, but I don't necessarily think he makes the individual decisions to, kill a million people in
Of course.
whatever.
That
Yeah.
time.
Yeah, I did want to just sort of branch back. So, um, I wanted to aim towards this more towards the beginning of the actual podcast, but it seems to have skimmed us into all the interesting discussions that we've been having. So, I think the religious influences on practically, like most of your work nowadays, Shazam, are pretty apparent. And I think we also spoke about the fact that you had this channel where you were reading, for example, I think it was just general scripture, but I remember something distinct about like specific books in the actual Bible. And I was actually considering whether to bring it up earlier, but I wasn't sure if this was a subject to be talked about. And regarding the start of the podcast, we kind of aimed towards, okay, so this is a thing and we can talk about this. So, you also had a channel that I noticed on YouTube called Now Read This.
Mhm.
Is that correct?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and you were reading like a whole bunch of different in the normal audiobook format, but it was more like person to person, so it felt more,
I was thinking.
I wouldn't say intimate, but it felt more personal, like the passages that were personal to you, or just books that you were interested in, series and whatnot. So regarding the inspirations for Now Read This, was it just a general urge to convey all these messages that you were interested in, or was it just like a spur of the moment thing, like, hey, let's um, for the same way that you actually wrote your book, hey, I enjoy doing this, let's do this, let's show people this, and you didn't aim towards accumulating that audience that you actually eventually got, which is quite sizable. So I was really interested in that channel and the ideas behind it, even if it seems like a minor thing in the point of view of these discussions that we're having now.
Um, the reason I started that was because music was taking the turn that it was taking.
Yeah.
Books for me and audiobooks for me were very, very, very important when I was younger. Like I read, and listened to. I think Jordan just dropped out.
Yeah,
I
he'll
read
come back.
tons and tons of books, listened to tons and tons of audiobooks. This was like a constant thing. And as music sort of took over as the as the priority, and making that a career and having success with that, books and literature kind of went to the wayside. I was learning a lot more just about music and investing myself in instruments, writing, producing, things like that,
Mm.
performing. Um, when music began to become something I wasn't super happy with, comfortable with, I needed basically an outlet. and I'd always wanted to make audiobooks, so I just decided I was going to start a fucking YouTube channel and make them. Um, the first videos that I uploaded, it's like I can't even watch them anymore. It's the same thing. Like I can't listen to harassment architecture anymore. I just don't. It's like going back, and I don't know. It's hard for me to listen to, or you know this with your own books. Probably it's hard to go back to your own books sometimes and be like, wow, I can't believe I said this, or I would have said this a different way. So
Absolutely, yeah.
it's like critical. I don't think that should stop you from appreciating where you come from. It's just, you know, I think
Yeah,
that's natural
it's
with
a
anybody who creates something.
yeah, it's a sort of similarity between you and I guess, because we both released our first books in 2022. And it's hard to believe that it's coming up on 3 years now. So certainly when I look towards back my first work, I'm like, shit, why did I say it this way? Couldn't I have
Mhm.
like hired an additional editor to look through this, or should I have to like double question? I could have read this again and been like, no, I wouldn't say it that way. I would say it another way. And I think a
Just
lot of that comes to any artist.
have me edit it next time, dude.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
I
yeah.
I'll, I
Yo,
would love to read your book. I didn't know that you wrote one
yeah, no, I'll
um
hit you up.
until we started this, but
Yeah,
YouTube was like, sorry.
yeah, yeah. No, I'll allow you to go on, but I was gonna say, it was on my Instagram page. I always have my website on Instagram page, like linked to it, and I've noticed that I think it's also that not a lot of people actually notice the website or think it's like real, but then those that do, they come to it and they can't find the book. So I just realized, okay, I may be actually better at writing than I am at web design because I'm quite a shit at it. So regarding the art and looking back at things, it's more apt to me to look back at things that way when I'm like doing the little like side coding or whatever, because then I'm worse at that. I'm more of a word cell than anything. But go on. You were talking
No,
about YouTube.
same. I'm not a developer.
Yeah.
But YouTube was fun. I didn't really, again, expect it to do anything. Um, it's still, I mean, I think I'm about to get to like 5,000 subscribers, which is like nothing. But
Yeah.
again, it wasn't to make money. It was simply to interpret the books how I wanted to and just practice. That was kind of how I started with audiobooks. Um, and after that, it just got better. It's just practicing and immersing yourself in it. I love accents. Um,
Oh yeah, I noticed.
yeah, yeah, I read them like all in English accents, but that's because my favorite audiobooks are always recorded by British people.
Oh yeah.
I feel like they have. I can't believe how many dialects and like accents are within the whole country that you
Yeah, I
live in.
drive for half an hour here and people talk completely different, and it's nice in a way because Jordan's joining back in, so I'll allow him in. But I was gonna say it feels nice in a way to do that sort of thing in the UK, because I found out that in America, when you talk to a lot of people, as you said, you're Polish and Sicilian, and you get a lot of, I guess, interest or backlash for that in those dissident communities. And I've noticed that too because of Polish ancestry. But unless I tell someone like where my heritage comes from here, they don't really care. Because when you go somewhere like Edinburgh or Glasgow, and you talk to these people, it doesn't really matter to them that where you're from, unlike in America. They just care that you're a foreigner. Like
Mm,
for a lot of these people, when you come up to their little communities, it's like, um, oh, you're a European slash American foreigner. Okay, we're gonna lump you all into that one group. Doesn't matter whether you're from France or Germany or Ireland or even Ireland, funnily enough, or America or Canada. As long as you don't have too much of an accent that we get suspicious, you know.
mm,
You're one of the you're kind of like us, but not so much because you don't know what different breeds of sheep mix with what other different breeds of sheep, or you don't know where to drink at the local pub. You know, it's you have
mm,
that sort of similarity, but then again, not. And that's the same. It's sort of similar to the kind of way that British people interpret each other. Like the region where you're from really matters a lot more than in America. But in America, when someone asks you where you're from, because it's such a diverse country for the better or the lack of it, people are going to go, "Oh, I'm 5% Italian, 5% French, 10% German." That's why all these ancestry companies that take your DNA.
mm.
That's why they mostly operate within the US, because then people have really lost that connection with their original culture or language or heritage, and are really curious where they come back from. And that's why a lot of, I think, American families vacation in Europe. That and the fact that the visa is so easy to get,
Mm.
and or visa free access. But I think a lot of those people have that keen interest in it because they're sort of disconnected from it. And whereas in the UK, it's just like you can drive from one side to Florida to the other, and it'll take you 8 hours. When I've driven from Miami to Tallahassee, that shit took me like 9.5 hours with the stops at Wow and Publix along the way. But here, if I drove for 9.5 hours, I'd end up in the middle of the fucking North Sea, right? To get from one side of the UK, so take the lowermost points like Dover or Bristol, to get to the tops, which would be like Edinburgh or Glasgow or the Isle of Skye, where you're literally deep in the Scottish Highlands, where people speak a different language practically, because when you get that far up north, people are more keen to speak Scots than they are to speak English, um, or at least have a very, very, very heavy accent that implies they know another language. Um, it's just such a totally different experience. So it's the inverse from the US, where you have all these people and they're so clearly different, but because
Mm.
they speak the same language, you're all Americans. So just we're all Americans at the end of the day, is what it says.
Yeah, I feel bad that the southern accent is it it makes me
It's
sad.
extinct in Florida.
Yeah, it's well, no, it's not extinct there. I just feel like people with so much movement of people, it is starting to fade, and
Mhm.
that's something that I would feel bad about for England in general. Is just all those different voices and all those different accents, a half hour away, completely different. It would break my heart to see all of those go away. I just think
Yeah.
it's beautiful. It kind of gives me the same feeling as when I hear about Native American languages going extinct. I don't know anything about them.
Yeah,
It's just like this feeling that I get where I'm like, shit, an entire language is extinct. It's like sad.
yeah,
Uh,
the Cockney accent has died, the British one, where the Americans, when they speak English, when they emulate it, they pull the English accents, like the British bottle of water, that
yeah.
almost entirely, like God Save the Queen, that almost entirely doesn't exist anymore. Uh, the Queen, fair enough.
Yeah.
That almost entirely doesn't exist anymore because the people that originally spoke that language have either like moved out, or there's not as many of them anymore in London. Some people out here call it the London Exclusive Economic Zone, and by some people I mean my one of my British friends, because everyone here pretty much says it's a different country. Because London is
Mm.
such like a capital of the world, and there's 10 million people living in there, and people often, I've had Americans ask me, is England in London, which fairly summarizes it. But I've had a lot of repeat. It's like when you compare it to the second biggest city, it's almost 5 times, 6 times larger. So they don't recognize the fact that the UK has a population of 70 million because 10 million of those are in London, and no other country that is developed has like, except for maybe Japan or somewhere far in East Asia, they don't have like almost 20% of their population situated in one city. And
Mm.
when that happens, the native like Londoner accents die out as they have died out. So there is now not a London accent anymore. There's just, specific accents for specific little parts of
Yeah.
London that
Well.
still remain and that haven't been touched too much by commercialism.
Yeah.
Jordan, we're glad to have you
No, I
back.
was. Yeah. Sorry about my temporary absence from the Zoom meeting. It's just there was some glitch with Zoom, and I was having trouble logging back in, but I'm
You're
fine
good.
again
Don't worry
now.
about it.
So yeah.
Shazam, you
Well,
were
in regards,
gonna.
sorry.
No, go on.
Yeah, I was just gonna say briefly in regards to what you just said, because I wanted to actually. So in my notes, I had two topics that I wanted to touch on that we briefly discussed them, but again, very briefly in a very abrupt and terse manner. So I just want to hone in on those two for some more protracted type of discussion, and then maybe we should wrap it up after, just because we have been running for about,
Probably.
I think,
We've been
two
going.
hours.
I think this has
There-
been our longest
yeah,
podcast
this
so
has
far.
definitely
So
been one
yeah.
of our longest podcasts. Well, maybe the one with Geo was a little bit longer because that was about two
Yeah, that's probably
hours.
why I still can't upload it. So
Yeah,
yeah.
that one we're having trouble with that. Even though it was a great discussion actually, and I don't know if you're Shazam. Are you familiar with that guy Giant Geo or Giovanni Pinichetti?
No.
Because no, he runs in many of the same circles actually that we do, and he's friends with Paul Town. They spoke on this one podcast called Break the Rules. I don't know if you've
Mm.
heard that one. I actually,
That sounds familiar.
yeah,
And I
it's
love Paul. Like I fucking
yeah.
love Paul.
Yeah, no, dude. Okay, you know what? Because you just mentioned him, here's what I mean when I'm referring to the notes that I had. So that transitionary period, or that liminal space, you could say, between your musical ventures and your forays into the world of distant spaces. That's what I wanted. What I wanted to touch on. What I wanted to understand really is what was going through your head, or rather, what was your life like when you found out about people like Mike Maw and Paul Town and these really weird Hunter S. Thompson type of literary figures in the modern world? Because, like you said, I'm fascinated by those guys as well, particularly Paul Town. I've actually been
Okay.
recently getting into him, so I was just wondering, how did you stumble on those types of guys? What drew you to them, and just what was going on in your life when you were intrigued by them? And how did you actually manage to collaborate with them? Because you obviously have somewhat of a relationship with them, considering that you recorded both of their audiobooks, so not just anyone would let you do that. So I was just interested in that aspect.
Yeah, man. Okay, well, I was on tour in 2016. It
Yeah,
was either 2016, 2017, I can't remember.
yeah,
Um, and I had a friend. He was the guitarist in my very first band ever that I started with my younger brother,
yeah.
like a high school thing. It was a lot of fun. Um, and I was always like traditional conservative, obviously,
Yeah.
because it's associated with Christianity. So you're like pro life, you know. I would just say like basic normie conservative, you know.
Yeah.
I was reading like Dinesh D'Souza and
Oh wow.
like people like that.
That's the
Which
most
like,
shit, bro.
I mean,
That's
in
the most.
some ways it's like, well, they were good books at that time in my life. Like I really liked this one Dinesh D'Souza book when I was really young. I think it was probably 9 or 10. I don't know. Um anyway, so I mostly had been exposed to that stuff. But then growing up in the city that I was growing up in, I was very frustrated with blacks and homeless people. Um, I'd gotten into nutrition a whole lot. So there was all of these kinds of ideas that I was having that weren't fitting anywhere. I was very disillusioned with the politics in general.
Wait, sorry, not to interject, but you'd also, just for context, you'd also basically quit music, right? So you quit the band group or something like that.
No. So
Sorry. So I was saying,
early, like during music, it was this kind of process of like,
okay,
well, I'm having to entertain and affirm gay people indirectly, like at shows, and sell my music and sell merchandise, sell tickets to these people. I can't talk, but I think all of these other things, and I can't say them. Um,
So
and
it's
I
this
was,
disillusionment in 2016, basically.
yeah,
yeah,
I mean, this was like 2014 through 2017. It was a pretty big chunk of like
Constant thing, yeah.
evolving, yeah, past this stuff where I was just like, okay, I'm setting up a show in San Francisco and I want to kill everyone. Not really, but you know what I'm saying. It's just like,
That's a great
holy
title
fuck.
for a book.
yeah.
Yeah.
Great
Okay.
first line.
um, man, we'll clip that. Use it. We'll use it. Uh, I was just like, am I fucking going insane? Kind of. And I really wanted success in music. It was fun. I loved performing and I loved writing and stuff. But I was just getting really, really sick of all this shit. So I was on tour in 2016. I'd gone to like every major city in the States. The theme was consistent. I was like really, really tired. Very, very sick of homeless people. I hated cities at this point. Um, it was just like I feel like I was coexisting with Poison. Not the band members like that. Those guys were amazing. They were all on the same page. We were all on the same page.
Yeah.
Um, we
Wait, so
still
you
are.
glam shit back in the day, right?
What's up?
You were really into the glam shit, right? Is that like
Oh
glam?
yeah, yeah. I still am. Like I love fur coats and I
Yeah,
like clothes and fashion and stuff. Yeah,
yeah.
I love
Anyways,
all that.
perfect. Cool.
Um, Still, like I would still, if I was playing shows now, like it's a performance. It's performance art. It's fun. Like
Yeah,
if you're wearing a t-shirt and jeans, you to me it's just boring.
yeah. I agree.
Um, but in 2016, we stopped by somewhere in Nevada where my friend, who was the guitarist of my first band, he was going to college. We'd always had disagreements because he was like leftist. He was like left leaning.
Mhm.
Um, and we connected after a show and we just started talking about stuff. And there was like this synergy. And I was like, holy shit, he's gone from like further left than I ever was to like further right than I ever was. Again, for lack of a better terms.
It's the circle analogy.
Yeah,
It proven correct.
yeah.
Horseshoe theory.
So he was like, I was just pouring out my heart. I was really tired, and we were eating or something, and he gave me 3 books. Um, Two by this guy named Vox Day. Do you guys know Vox Day?
Yeah, I know. Oh yeah.
Okay,
Yep.
Cool.
Dude,
So
this is some 2016 type of shit,
Yeah,
man.
This is
yeah.
very 2016, man. Go
Yeah, yeah,
on.
yeah.
Dinesh
So,
D'Souza, Vox Day, go on.
well, Dinesh D'Souza was way
Like,
before
oh,
then.
staying. Oh, bro, that takes me back.
Yeah,
But
yeah. So, and I
Go
still
on.
like read his blog sometimes. I like a lot of what that guy said. Anyway, he gave me this book called SJWs Always Lie and one called Conservative. And
Eh,
those books like changed. I've never read a book in a car because I get car sick. And I read
mhm.
both of them like back to back twice in just on tour. Um, and specifically SJWs Always Lie, it was like I haven't read those books in a long time, but it was exactly kind of where I was at, where he's talking about how to SJW proof like your business, your life, like your money, essentially. And I'm surrounded by all of these types of people. There's no one in the music industry that will talk. Like they're all normies, for lack of a better term. So I read that, and then I read Conservative, and I'd never been introduced to any sort of nationalist sort of perspective on anything, um, race, IQ, things like that. But it was all basically just confirming all of these things that were already in my head, and it prepped me hardcore for cancellation, things like that, like concepts like not apologizing, not backpedaling, those types of maybe basic understand. Most people would understand those things now. It's like if you guys got canceled, uh, never apologize. It's
Yeah, that's the
that
thing a
simple.
lot of people don't do.
Yeah,
Like they fail to move on. And I think a lot of these people that are actually in mainstream media, like even music or celebrities, whenever
yeah,
they do something that someone on the internet, someone fucking irrelevant thinks is like remotely fucked up, they issue a statement. I apologize. I
yeah.
wasn't educated. I
or
previously wasn't educated on
yeah,
the main parts of this actual knowledge that I was failed to inform on. I was misinformed, and now I'm
or the
trying my best to educate myself and do better. I am a growing as a human person, as a human
Right.
being, and I need to do better. It's just like never do that because then people acknowledge that there is
And
something
they don't want
wrong
you
or
to be
deficient
sorry.
about you.
Yeah, it's they don't want an apology. It's they want you to admit that you were wrong. They want you to
Yeah, and then
to
so they can
you
use
know
that against you. Yeah.
yeah, and affirm that they're correct. So it's anyway, I read those books, and it was like my whole brain, I feel like, was doing a 360 in my head. Like, oh, there's people that are thinking these things and not just saying like, oh, we need to go campaign for Roe v. Wade to be overturned. And I'm not saying those things are bad. It's just it's politics. So I was like, oh, I don't have to be political. I don't have to think left or right. It's like this is all normal. Like the fact that I'm noticing blacks to this degree is like normal, and homeless people in the state of cities, and the fact that I can't speak. So those books were really instrumental in just freeing me from maybe self-imposed falling into line in the music. And I just was like, okay, well, I can't really go forward doing what I was doing. So I
Yeah.
decided to do what I was doing and just do something else. Um, that's how the YouTube channel started. I was just like, I need an outlet while we're kind of in label limbo. And then through Vox Day's books, I just started reading around and looking around in on Twitter, stuff like that.
yeah,
I found Ma from Milo,
oh
because
yeah,
Milo was like, doing a lot of crazy shit at this point. The thing
yeah,
that really bugged me about Milo though was like it's like a woman now talking, like sharing opinions online. Like any woman sharing an opinion online, unless it has to do with like diet, child rearing, or being a wife, like, I just do not care. You, your opinion is completely irrelevant to me. I do not give a fuck. So a gay person saying all this stuff, whether it's true or not, I was like, why is a gay person telling me what I need to do? This is like a black female telling white men what they need to do. Totally fucking bullshit. So, but I started reading some of Mike's articles. There was like this review he wrote of a book, or it's the movie The Last Jedi or something. It was like a Star Wars movie. I read this article and I was just dying, like dying laughing. And there was just
yeah. He's
something
a funny
about,
guy.
yeah, there was something about his writing that I was like, oh, this guy is um is doing something different and encapsulating something different. And there was an energy behind it that I felt was as you said before, Jordan, like pure. Um,
Yeah.
maybe not completely pure, but still like, oh, this is we're getting to the bottom of things. We're getting to the truth of things. So he like disappeared from the internet, and then he came back. I was talking about his like I talked to him online. Like I just messaged him. I was like, hey, I like your articles. You want to make music or something? And then he disappeared. And then I was talking about him with my friends because the last thing he told me was he was working on a book, and I'd been doing audiobooks at this point. And he announced his book like 2 days later. He came back and like announced he had a book. And I was like, oh, well, I could record his audiobook because I know somebody's going to fuck it up. Like I listened to Vox Day's audiobooks. People that read those, I didn't like. The guy that read Bronze Age Pervert's book, I didn't like. I was, and I'm not trying to rip on those people. I just didn't like the way that things were performed. I didn't like the quality of the recording. And I knew that I could do it better. So I hit him up and I was like, hey, you want me to record this for you? I sent him a sample. He said it'll be, I think he said it'll be a home run, something like that. And then I just recorded it. And that was a best-selling audiobook.
Yeah, man, that's a
Um,
nice story.
dude,
Oh,
yeah. And then through that, like,
that's
uh, it was the same thing. Like the other thing is like, I'm not really interested. I'm only interested in who I'm interested in. Like,
Mhm.
and I only feel like I can communicate what I can communicate. Like there's certain things I'll take on and certain projects that I'll take on that I like. Um, and even if it's not something I perform, I'll do it because I like it. I recorded a book that's just on health and diet for a guy. I loved the book. It's not really a performance book. It's just like an informative, yeah, it's an informative text. And I recorded that. But like there aren't that many people in the space where I read their stuff or get a sense of them where I'm like, this is like almost it's like I can't really explain it or encapsulate it. That's how I felt about Mike's stuff. And then when I found out about Paul, I don't even remember how I found out about Paul, but
yeah, yeah.
um,
So
Paul was like, even now, like I don't really know Paul, you know, like
he's a mysterious
no,
guy,
I've
honestly.
talked to him like
Like,
one time, maybe two times, and I'll text him sometimes like
yeah.
about books, but then I'll watch his streams on occasion. That guy is like,
Dude, that guy's a fucking character, honestly.
yeah,
He's a fascinating guy. Like I feel
yeah.
like everyone agrees on that.
I really love his books. Like a lot of people don't get them, which totally makes sense to me. I think that if you get them, there's probably something wrong with you. And the funny Paul will do this thing where he'll take like a paragraph. I'll be reading a paragraph, I'll be recording it, and he'll start the sentence off with something that you agree with, right? And you'll go from like, oh, I agree with this statement, and then the next sentence will make you feel like a retard for agreeing with the statement, and then
Yeah.
the third sentence will be like, actually, I'm changing my opinion, and then the fourth sentence will make you feel like a retard for questioning your initial opinion. um he's just like, I don't even know what his goal is. I don't know what Paul's fucking goal is, like on anything. I don't pretend to know
Dude,
it, but
no, I
his
feel like
stuff
no
just makes
one
me laugh. Like I think it's funny. I think that he makes you think about shit you don't want to think about. I think he does make good points. I think he's a lot better of a writer than he even thinks he is.
yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So anyway,
Well, I would say the appeal of Paul is that he's almost the epitome of the schizo energy of the internet. Like
sorry, you're freezing up a little bit.
Yeah, Jordan, you're like freezing all the way off. Can you hear me, by the way?
I can hear you. Yeah.
Yeah, I wasn't sure if my microphone stopped working or not.
I was talking for a long time, so
Yeah, no, it's fine.
Jordan, I can't hear you, but um, I'm a huge fan of Paul's work. Massive. Like I think most he's people are like sleeping on Paul's books and they shouldn't be. Um, then again, it's so weird that it doesn't surprise me that a lot of people just will never be into it. So yeah, huge fan, huge fan of Paul.
Yeah, I was gonna say one of the biggest fears that I had as an author is that one day after I pass away and the work is in the public domain, there will be an audiobook made of it by like a Chinese woman with a very heavy Chinese accent, and the entire thing will be just misinterpreted. I think it's a very important fact for books to be voiced by a person that actually has the voice to accompany the book, to accompany the themes, because I don't want it's not just that I write fiction, so it would be something like the main character, and I wouldn't want the main character to be voiced by someone that doesn't sound like them. But as a
Mm,
secondary thing, it's also if it reflects deep philosophical themes. I think there's also like ways to do it and ways not to do it. Someone has to have some sort of not only voice but like inflection on certain things. It needs to feel like it fits in, like it's not something mundane or it's archetypal or archetypal or whatever. I'm
mm.
sure you can, realize that sentiment as well.
Yeah, I think I mean, I'll record it for you. I got to read it and see, but
No, no, no. And
did you already
ship has
record one?
sailed for future projects. I'll keep you in mind, but I feel like that
Did you record
sentiment,
one?
huh?
You recorded an audiobook for it?
I had a deal with someone to record an audiobook for it, and I think that fell through.
Ah,
But I can't exactly disclose what I'm working on, but it's in the
no, that's fine. Yeah,
Yeah,
good.
but I was talking more of as in the sentiment is on your part where you read something and then you'd be like, okay, this is something that I'd be fine recording an audiobook for, whereas other things it doesn't fit thematically. And I think as far as making money goes and sharing all this stuff goes, okay, Jordan, Jordan, we can't hear you. As far as sharing that stuff goes, I feel like is he glitching out or is it just
Yeah,
me?
no, no, it's yeah.
Sir,
I feel bad for Jordan
I
because you've
really
been
do.
ripping
It
on
seems
him,
like
and
he's
now
been
it's
consumed by the void. He'll be fine. Don't
can
worry about
you
it.
guys hear me right now? Because I've just been experiencing
I
some.
can hear you fine now. Yeah.
yeah, that works.
I was gonna say, Shazam, like as far as sharing that stuff goes, I feel like you also yourself as an audiobook creator would recognize when something would be up your alley or if it wouldn't.
Wait,
And I
can you
feel like
guys
with
hear
your
me now?
offer too, with your book debut of
Um, um,
Fool's Renaissance, you would recognize that too, where you would be like, I
Yes.
want this to be interpreted in a certain way, you know?
Yeah, that's been very difficult for me because I still haven't recorded my own. And Jordan, I could hear you. I don't know about now, but
I think your Wi-Fi
yeah, I
is
can
low.
hear you. I can hear you. So we're good now. We're good. I think we
it's
resolved
still
it.
doing that thing. It's still
Yeah, maybe
yeah.
there's some problems
Um no, it's difficult. I think
with the Wi-Fi.
yeah, I'm sorry, dude. It's glitching in
It
and
feels
out.
like I'm next to a dying patient on a hospital bed.
It's okay. Don't beat yourself up about it, dude.
No,
Um
but Shazam, go on because I was curious why there wasn't an audiobook for A Fool's Errand, and the first time that I tried to acquire the book because it's not commonly available in the UK. It's very difficult to ship it here. I don't know if you're aware,
yeah.
but I was trying to look for an audiobook version, and I was very curious. Like, the audiobook creator has written a book, and it's not an audiobook.
I'm actually working on it now. I've said that
Awesome,
I think like to probably 10 different people over the last 3 years of like
awesome.
I'm working on it. But I went through a couple different ideas for what it would be. I didn't know if I was going to have somebody else do it, if I was going to have a bunch of different people do it, or if I was just going to do it myself. And
Hmm.
um, I'm still deciding. I think it will be a mix of all of those things, but I want to get that out probably by March, like the spring. It would be cool to have it
That'd be
before,
awesome.
and then the follow up to the book will actually come out probably June. It'll be in the same vein. It'll basically be a follow up and more of a sequel. But for Paul's stuff, yeah, the coolest thing about working with Paul is like he's never ever given me um direction on it
Hmm.
on any of his books. I think part of that has to do with he literally like doesn't care. Paul, I don't think cares how his shit is recorded. I don't think he listens to them.
Did
Um,
you?
but I was just like, oh man, this stuff is too funny and too good not to be just performed. And the way that I chose to do it was a lot of fun, and the way that he allows me to do it is like a dream come true because you have no
You have no rules. Um, and there is no like standard. And I think that fits very well with the writing, like because that's kind of how Paul's writing is. It could be like there's a chapter in the first one that I did for him. It's just all grunting.
Hmm.
It's literally just the word grunt like 200 or 300 times or something.
Did you grunt for that? Because I
Yeah,
haven't listened to the audiobook.
yeah. I had me and my friend like had a grunting conversation back and forth.
Wait,
Um, so
Shazam, first of all, can you hear me right now?
We can
yeah,
hear
yeah,
you. We
Yeah,
can
yeah.
hear
We
you
can hear
much
you
better
now.
now.
Yeah.
I connected to some Wi-Fi, this Wi-Fi network. So did you actually, I heard about this on Justin Murphy's podcast when he talked to Paul Town. I don't know if you're familiar with Justin Murphy. He's a cool guy. He
Mhm.
definitely inhabits some of the same spaces that we do. But on that podcast, Paul Town actually said that he once burned down a house or some shit like that because he was having some type of psychotic break and then he got arrested as a result. But apparently apparently he acted like that was in character for him though. You know what I'm saying? Like he didn't
Uh,
talk about it as if it was some strange, bizarre incident. He was like, "Oh yeah, that shit happens every other week for me." Basically, he's an interesting guy. I'd say. I don't know if you've heard of that story, but he's
I didn't even know about that until I'd recorded, I think, the first one. So there's like a lot of Paul lore that I don't know. Um,
he has a lot
That's
of fun.
amazing.
Yeah,
yeah, and that's it's like I like that kind of stuff, but again, that's the cool thing about not knowing him very well is I get to either choose to believe it or not to believe it, like depending on whatever it is I feel at the time. So I'm reading his books like from this lens that only I have of who Paul is, and I think that's probably what he likes. I think that's probably what he likes. Like, um, I feel like he contradicts himself on purpose, and puts out opposing opinions maybe on purpose,
yeah,
even
definitely.
within the same book. You know.
Yeah,
You
builds
need to have lore.
that enigmatic here, that aura of mystique. I'd say, and I think that's pretty central to who he is, really, or at least how he markets himself online. But
Yeah,
yeah,
I was going to ask one more question
okay,
because I haven't brought up any of
yeah,
Shazam's
no,
collaboration with Mike yet. I know that you have, Jordan.
we've been
But
going
you were going on about how you met Mike through Milo. So how did that go towards voicing harassment architecture all the way back then?
Oh, not through Milo. Like I don't know him. Um,
Mm,
it was just through Vox really because as soon as I read those books, it kind of like put me into that sphere or those circles that you're talking about. And there's like
yeah,
there's too many people.
yeah, just
I don't know all of them. They don't know me. Like that's the whole, it's fine with that way. Like um I think you're kind of meant to hear and glean from who you're meant to hear and glean from. Um but Mike, it was I just DM'd him. Like that's pretty much it. And I'd read an article from him that I think was either published in Breitbart or maybe Milo's like website way back in the day.
hmm
Um DM'd him, sent him a demo of some music, and then we just talked. He came back. I asked him if he wanted an audiobook. He said, yeah. Um, sent him a sample. I sent him the sample, and that day he was like, yeah, this is going to be great. This is perfect. And then that's how the collaboration happened. The
It's
yeah,
quite
second,
interesting how many connections you can get, as you mentioned, online, like through people that you would have never met otherwise, just by simply reaching out to them.
yeah, because you know what, too, because there's also this scene online.
But that's what we have also done with this podcast. We would
Yeah,
have never met Charlie Looker if
we
we
almost
hadn't just reached out to him.
yeah, we almost act as culture curators in a sense. It's like we're highlighting the works and the ideas that circulate within certain scenes. It's
Yeah, not to amp you know, ourselves up or you know,
yeah,
pump our dick too much, but
yeah, but
no,
also
that's
in a
just
way,
networking and being interested. And again, it's like with the just reaching out to Mike. It's like, dude, the dude probably gets thousands of messages.
yeah,
I
you
know I get
mm,
shitloads of messages. Like you can't possibly keep up with them all. Sometimes it's a
yeah.
miracle that I even go on a podcast because like sometimes I just don't check them.
Yeah, I think it helps to be genuinely interested in the work of the person that you're reaching out to.
Yeah, and
I
then
think a lot of cases when it does end up in something, yeah.
offering value to those people through your expertise. So it's just like I knew that I was going to like Mike's book, knew that I was going to like it. Did
Yeah.
I agree with everything in it? No. Do I agree with everything in any book that I record? Probably not, but that's not the point. It's like, for me, I just knew that it needed to be communicated correctly and right. And I think it came across. The second one, I tracked the whole thing. Um, and then months later, we met up and tracked like music, and re-recorded a couple of things that he changed in the text. I don't know if you know that about his books, but he's edited the text on each of them multiple times.
Oh, wow.
So the first one is going to be different than the next two or three that he
Yeah.
just puts up. He just uploads like a different script. It's a
Is
pretty
that what you
interesting.
did for your book, or was it a bit different? And would you agree with the stuff that you said in your book now, 3 years later?
Um, I think probably most of it. I'd have to go back and read some of it through again. There's things. There's something in the book that I wrote about reading your Bible. It's just a chapter on reading the Word of God, and it was something like, don't. It doesn't really matter what version you read.
Yeah.
I think fundamentally that's true. Like at a very, very basic level, because I
Mhm.
grew up reading like the New International Version, right?
Yeah. Same.
But then I found out all this gay shit about the New International Version and how many iterations it's gone through and
Yeah, of course.
revisions it's gone through, and then people that have been on the board of directors who've altered the text, who are like openly gay. Um, and so thankfully I had one that was like from the 1980s or 1990s or something. And gradually I keep leaning towards KJV, even though that has its own, as you're a Catholic, so you probably have,
Oh yeah.
a little bit about the KJV.
And I
That
live in the UK
that has a
right
lot
now.
of there's shady things about that too. But the interesting thing is really, unless it changes fundamentally what the verse says, then I think it's true. I think
Mhm.
maybe though my perspective on that has shifted a little bit. Um, my perspective on women really hasn't changed. I'm pretty fundamentally like decided on what I think women should be doing, what they should be offering. Um, I'm not like, what's that term that it's like a major red pill term for men who like hate women. MGTOW?
MGTOW,
Is
yeah.
it
Men go
MGTOW
hard.
or whatever?
Yeah.
Okay. Like I'm not that that way. Uh I just I always look at the fruit of people's lives and the fruit of things. So it's like, if this is bearing fruit and it's good fruit, then the tree does not need to be hewn down.
Yeah.
So when I look at the fruit of women's lives who have careers, I always want to cut down that tree. When I look at the fruit of women's lives that run, political talk shows online, like, that's a tree I want to cut down.
Yeah.
Um, so I think it was pretty harsh with women, but realistically, like I love them and they have a great wisdom and great perspective, but it has to be tempered with um, nature and submission to authority, which I think that's kind of the same way with men. If men are not tethered to the authority of God, then they're not living purposefully.
Then they become tyrants sometimes.
Yeah, or just gay. Like, you know,
Which
uh,
reminds me, I've drank the corn syrup. I should be, it should be
it's
kicking in any time now.
we all do stupid shit, man. I'll drink like a soda here and there. I think it depends. If it's affecting your health, then that's where I have a problem with it. I think the stuff that I wrote in the book too about doing things like that, a lot of it's funny, a lot of it's supposed to wake you up maybe from a stupor or a lie that you're telling yourself. But at the
Yeah.
end of the day, like, you're going to die,
Yeah.
so
What are
do
your
you?
thoughts on nicotine?
I vape, dude.
Yeah,
Still,
fuck
it's
yeah. Yeah, I,
gay.
I was doing like I don't know if you saw me, but I was pretty much just engrossed in my nicotine habit all throughout this podcast. It keeps me
Yeah,
still.
I've been vaping. You haven't. I don't know if you've noticed me. You probably go and post and notice it. I love cigarettes, but cigarettes affect my voice pretty badly.
Mhm.
like the longevity of how long I can talk and
I
record.
found that cigarettes like wake you up more, like they give me a kick where it feels like I'm awoken and alert now.
Mm,
Whereas vaping, you can do it more consistently throughout the day.
mm,
I know that a lot of people, like a shit ton of people, especially on the dissident right, like look down on it. They think it's very gay.
mm.
Um, but I
I mean,
found
it
that,
is, but
yeah,
half of that
but
is like you kind of have to admit that to yourself,
yeah, but
and you
it's
know,
of course, but it's efficient to also store like so much nicotine in one, like not to say pouch, but like in one place where you can. It's handy. You don't have to light
mm,
it.
mm.
I it
Well,
sounds
I think
a
nicotine is
little bit like a
cool.
cope, but
I
you
like
know, it's
nicotine.
efficient.
Yeah, the shit that's in it isn't good. I don't have really a problem with nicotine.
Yeah.
But
I
dude,
listen, I'm in it for the nicotine. I've tried nicotine in all different forms. It's a super fuel for me.
yeah.
It's bad for
Well,
me, of course, but I'd rather die of lung cancer at 40 or 50 than live long and then get some other disease.
mm. But yeah, I mean, essentially though, it's like, yeah. Again, I always go back to the fruit. What is the fruit that somebody's bearing or somebody's efforts are bearing?
Hmm.
And that's usually the correct judgment. And that was Christ's judgment.
Hmm.
So in anything, whether it's dissident or not, even in those spaces, there's a lot of people with a lot of cool things to say, a lot of crazy opinions. I always try to look at the fruit of their lives, and I always try to look at what they're doing. If what they're saying is what other people should do, there's a lot of people I've
Yeah,
been a little bit frustrated by because it's like they'll tell you what to do. Do
yeah,
not live like that. We all have that capability too, and because we all have original sin, we can all live in sin, stumble.
of
Um,
course. There's some people that, portray themselves as being the ultimate good, but in fact, in their private lives, they're the ultimate evil.
yeah,
The
yeah,
monster of their household, yeah.
we can be total retards and total sinners.
And yeah,
Yeah.
go. No, no, no. I was gonna say regarding the conservatives and whatever. I've noticed that there is some hypocrisy in some of the big like talking figures, and one that I've noticed without going to the mainstream like Ben Shapiro ones. I'm not sure what the name of the guy was, but I'm not sure if you've heard of this, but there's this guy a while back that was preaching like traditional values or whatever, and then a video got leaked of him like screaming at his wife. Of
uh,
but it was like a fully irrational argument, not in the like she did something wrong and he was screaming at her.
Wait, is
He
this the
was
guy
like,
who? Is this the guy?
I know who you're
Oh,
talking about.
wait,
This
yeah,
wait,
yeah,
is
is
it the
yeah.
guy who was screaming at that one girl, Ashton Whitty, baked
No,
or something?
this was
I,
Steven Crowder.
Steven
Oh
Crowder. I was confusing him with like Dave Rubin, I think, for some reason.
no, dude, Dave Rubin is gay. Yeah.
Yeah.
No,
No, but
I'm not into these online spaces too much. I tend to stay away from them just
honestly,
because I don't
that's
want to
that's
have my
good on you, bro.
brain
That's
poisoned.
Yeah, and then half of the time if you're affirming something or really obsessed with something and then that person ends up being something else, it's difficult. It's difficult to weed through it. And again, I
Yeah, and
think
then you have to agree with it all, like all the controversies, and defend them online and become a keyboard warrior. But no, Steven Crowder, right?
yeah, I don't
Yeah,
know
yeah,
much
that
about
was the
him.
guy's name. I
Was
know a
he
little bit about him,
this
but I think it was like an argument of him like screaming at his wife because he didn't want to like get off his ass or something and
no, but dude, to be honest,
the
this
groceries. Right?
describes countless conservative influencers, not just Crowder. Like if you guys remember Baked Alaska, who's kind of a, I don't like to talk.
That's a whole nother ball game, dude.
Yeah, I
That's
don't
not
about
that's not the
people.
same
Yeah,
like
I don't know most of these
comedian.
people. Like I've heard that name, but I know nothing about him.
Well, yeah,
Yeah.
basically, he kicked his girlfriend, who was also another conservative influencer. This girl Ashton Whitty, who's actually,
Maybe she needed it, dude.
yeah,
Yeah,
she's
why would you date a girl who's a conservative influencer? I'm
yeah,
sorry.
it's
No,
fun.
that's it. That's exactly it right there. Like, why would you date a woman that's talking on the internet? Or why
No,
would you date
because
a woman with a career?
well, that's
You're
another
dating a
thing.
man. That's what it is. That makes you gay.
I know,
Like,
but I found that the career ones is subjective. I think you're correct in saying that you're harsh on women. A lot of men wouldn't take that approach, but talking on the internet definitely. Like when I barely go on Twitter these days. I know Jordan is super into it, but when I do, and I see
No,
some woman on the timeline, and it's just like based trad fucking Mary or whatever, and her whole profile is just pictures of her in like sunskirts, and she's just like, we need to restore the based MAGA agenda. It's just like there is a 99% non-zero chance that this person is doing this for attention.
It's
Oh
just,
yeah.
bro, it's marketing for Sims. That's
It's
basically
marketing
it.
for Sims. That's
Like she's
exactly what it is. And then
marketing
there's
for
so
Sims.
many women that like spout like anti-feminist rhetoric on Twitter just because they know there's going to be a lot of men that are going to be like, Based, take my money.
Yeah,
Yeah. Well, then
that's
again,
that's
too, it's
living nowadays.
And that like
yeah.
strikes me as insane. I don't know why people do this to themselves,
I,
but
I
yeah,
do
that's
like I
besides the
do like
point.
women that run pages that again help with fertility, hormone balancing, birthing, midwives. Like
Well, that's
there's,
just self-improvement
but
for
that's like
people who are interested in this stuff. Yeah.
women being in a community amongst
It's just
themselves,
well-being. Yeah.
sharing tips about homeschooling and connecting to. It's like my wife uses those kinds of connections. Those are good connections.
Yeah, of
But when
course.
it comes down to, it's like I don't think you can make a good public forum if women are sharing their opinions. But it's the same thing as like women voting, you know.
Yeah,
But this is all almost
it's
normie
just
talk.
not gonna do well.
This is becoming normie talk because it's all been said before.
Yeah, well, it's being repackaged by normie friendly podcasts like Fresh and Fit and shit like that.
Mm.
And I
No,
forget.
but it's just like if people share their opinions online that way and try to grow an audience that way, and it's not just about well-being, and it's people that are fishing for attention. It's just never gonna do well, and that's
Yeah,
what I'm thinking about right
It
now.
comes back to fulfillment. It's like the reason I think that women shouldn't have careers is careers don't fulfill them. The reason that I think men should be providers and leaders is because it fulfills them. It's not always what each of us want, but
yeah,
a lot of the time, what we want is exactly the opposite of what fulfills us. It's like men want to abdicate and fuck off, and that
Hmm.
doesn't fulfill you. And so it's like I'm more focused on what fulfillment is than what happiness is kind of viewed as.
Hmm.
Um, and that's
I
if everybody had that perspective, it's like, well, that's when the world would be a better place. Is like, what is happiness? Well, happiness is fulfillment, and fulfillment only comes from living divine purpose, and
I
that's already
think it
been
comes within
established and
yourself,
given.
within doing what you're meant to do in life and not sidetracking yourself and enjoying that which you're doing for the sake of it rather than seeking
exactly.
external gratification like our society does.
Well,
Mhm.
But I was going to say very quickly, I think that's the main contrast between you and I, Shazam, but I think we come from very similar, if not alike, or exactly the same perspective. I think when it comes to like personal relationships, not even romantic ones, but friendships as well, I think men in general find great fulfillment in providing for others or being leaders. I think even if a lot of them suppress that desire, especially you see this on a lot of the like modern like liberal or centrist talking spaces, a lot of men like deny themselves like, oh, it's evil to take leadership or whatever, which is such bullshit. And in a
Mm.
lot of cases, men get supreme like gratification within themselves for like supporting their families. It's inbuilt into us. It's good for our survival. And
Mhm.
I personally, you know, I think there's a lot of women themselves that get trapped into careers that don't
Mm.
fulfill them at all. I think that's a rat race for external gratification. But also, as a matter of myself, I try to look in myself and I try to seek the best way to provide for others. What choices they make for themselves. In a, it's a very cringe libertarian like thing to say, but if people want to make bad choices for themselves, it's there's certain things that you can't enforce because the right or the light or the truth will ultimately come through. And people are going to
Mm.
come to their own conclusions regardless if they're unplugged from this giant society system, gaslighting, brainwashing thing. But I think it's become so commonplace for people to get narrowed and pinholed into making these decisions that are not good for themselves. I think if
Mm.
somebody finds fulfillment in what they do, then the only thing you can do as a man is support and provide for them as much as you can.
Mm.
So, I try not to extrapolate, but I get exactly where you're coming from, where this societal wide brainwashing and gaslighting that a lot of people seem to participate in, where it's just like you need to do this one thing to be fulfilled. And this type B personality thing, the quiet person that sits at the back of class and listens to everything the teacher is saying, well, they're going to absorb it because to them there is no other way. So I think it's about questioning what actually makes you fulfilled deep down. And I think men struggle with it probably even more than women. I mean, there's so many men that are just fucking lost in this thing.
yeah,
Yeah, it's because there's different types of leaders. There's different types of men that will be different types of leaders. You could be a leader of men. You could be a leader
You
of
could be a
just
really
your
shitty
house,
leader as a
your
guy.
home.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so I don't think it necessarily means everyone needs to lead a company, or everyone or every man needs to lead a group of people or be a leader of a church. It's the leadership of the home. So again, it's like, well, what is a man? I think that the really defining characteristic of a man is if he's the spiritual leader of his house and home. And if he's the
Mhm.
spiritual leader of his house and home, then everything else falls into place. And
Listen,
that
man.
again is innately
Yeah.
fulfilling for men.
All I'm gonna say is that, sorry, I
Uh,
interrupted you.
I was going to say, unless you decide not to get married for some reason, which,
Oh yeah.
like, that's biblical as well. You know,
Mhm.
if that's
Well,
what Paul kind of wishes.
I was going to say, because this actually provides a good transition into a potential.
No, absolutely. But Jordan, I just wanted to say something first. All
Yeah.
I want to say, and I'll make this short, regarding the women in careers. When the WEF pins me down and they have to take me to take the mandatory vaccine, all I want is I want there to be nurses. I want women to still be nurses so that I can have a hot nurse to actually give me the vaccine, because then it won't be as terrifying. When it comes
Mm.
to stuff like healthcare, when it comes to stuff like things that mainly target women, when it comes to stuff like that, even when it comes to like the women at the grocery store, like I find that a lot of those places it makes life pleasurable, especially when it's like literally there's nothing wrong and it's entirely wholesome for a girl to work as a waitress when she's in her 20s. It's just
Mm.
that the problem arises when a lot of these women prioritize their careers over like their families, and then the kids get all fucked up, and then there's 5 divorces. I see that all over America, and
Yeah,
it's
it's not
fucking
about
horrible.
making money though. Like when I say that, it's not about a woman making money. Like if you
Yeah.
read Proverbs 31, it talks about all of these different ways the good
Oh,
woman
okay.
is able to make money.
Yeah.
She buys a field, sells the field, clothes her children, like, and even Paul's like, the woman should guide the house.
Yeah, I was
So
gonna say that's entirely
these are
wholesome.
great things. I have no problem with a woman making money. When it comes before family, child rearing, being a wife, that's where, to me, it's defined as a
It
career.
gets depressing, yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Jordan, you were gonna make the transition, and I
I was going to
interrupted
say, well, the topics that we're actually discussing in the present moment pertaining to marriage, relationships, so on and so forth, they provide a perfect transition into the manner in which I want to conclude this podcast, because I do actually think that this is the longest podcast that we've ever recorded thus far. We're approaching 3 hours, so I thought it would be a
Hey,
good.
dude, Shazam, thank you for your time, because I expected you to be like our other guest saying in an hour I gotta wrap this up, but you've been with us for the long run.
I don't know why, but every time I do a podcast with anybody, it turns into the longest one they've ever done.
That's
It's yeah,
that's.
cut out and cut down whatever you want, dude.
I don't really think that we need
It's
to
up
cut
to
it
you.
down. To be honest, it was all quite interesting. It was all substantive.
It
It
was
was
all fun.
Yeah, it was all fun, definitely. But so to conclude, I think I wanted to ask you then a final question, because if I understand correctly, you married your wife recently, correct? That you had the wedding recently and all that.
Mm.
Okay, so in that regard, then, what advice would you have to offer for young men who are interested in settling down with a woman and perhaps raising a family one day? Because that does, in some sense, appear to constitute one of the highest ends of not just really men, but of people in general. You know, the
Mhm.
creation of family, the propagation of one's seed, basically from generation to generation, to ensure that your legacy lives on and out actually outlives you in a sense. So, what advice would you have then to maybe young guys like us, or to anyone else who would be interested in pursuing such a goal?
Yeah, man. I don't pretend to be like the ultimate expert on it. I can't, because again, like, I just got married this year. But I would say the work that I put into the relationship before marrying her was like the best work in some ways that I've ever had to do, or we ever had to do. So a lot of people get settled down or get married because they want to fuck, which is like totally natural. It's essentially why you would get married. According to Paul, it's like if you're not, it's better to marry than to burn with lust. So
Yeah,
if you have problems with this, if you have sexual desire, then get married. That's it. Never live with a woman ever before you're married. Don't do it. Just don't do it. Um, Try not to fuck before you're married. Just try to do it. Obviously, you can work through those things, but essentially the way that you start anything is the way that it'll end. The most powerful word in the world is no. And I would say don't be afraid to say it to anyone and everyone. males included, but a lot of the time women, it's this battle of wills where it's just like, listen, this is what I expect. I know we are all going to fall short of expectation, but this is what we're going to aim for. This is how things will be. And if you're not on board with these things that I'm outlining to you at the beginning, then you're not going to be on board with them at the end, which means there's a billion, plus women in the world. I can go find another one. You can go find another dude, but this is the way I will live my life. This is the way I will raise my children. You are expected to do these things. And if you can't or can't be on board with those things, or go when I say go, or stop when I say stop, then it's not going to work. Obviously, really, I'm like trying to consolidate it. It's not, I don't think you should be like harsh all the time with women. They're gentle creatures, but it's, you have authority. You're the leader. You're the head. You're the king. That's what it is. So, in like wooing one, I think it's just about being sure of who you are. Like most dudes that struggle with getting dates literally don't know who they are. Who
Yeah.
I am is in Christ. That's where it's rooted. So I'm solid. My foundation is on the rock, and women will sense that. I would also say, when you commit to anything, it will show up and commit to you if you stand by your commitment. So backpedaling, showing some openness to negotiation or compromise weakens you, and they won't follow you. So again, wooing is about following somebody who will follow you no matter what is happening. And again, I think too, it's the most important decision after who you will serve is who you will marry. So, if you've already picked and decided and you're rooted in who you'll serve, then women will sense that regardless, and they'll sense your intention, and sense your fortitude and your conviction. And women at the end of the day don't want sex. They want, love, but love has to come out of surety and confidence and leadership. That's what women want is really someone that they can respect and follow, because women want stability. Yeah, that's really what it's like. They just want it to be stable. They want somebody who will offer them emotional support and love. And if you're good with yourself, then that's going to be 100% easier. And if you're not, then you shouldn't be dating anyway, because all you're going to do is fuck it up. Like you're going to lead them on. You're going to change your mind. And that's not what a woman needs. It's much less like what a woman wants. I think that's pretty evident in the sense that women, it's like women like assholes. It's this whole, it's like a lie, it's a meme, but really that's what it is like, well, no, this is what I want. This is what I expect. This is how I will live. If we're going to do this, this is what will happen. And then, if they're good with those, I think too, talk about the most important things. It's like sex is the first thing that's going to leave. You're going to get older. She's going to get older. You're going to get older. It doesn't mean that you won't be able to have sex when you're older. It just is like, it's what most people are gravitating towards. But, think about how you're going to eat and how you're going to raise your children, where they're going to go to school, where you're going to live, how things are going to operate. It's like, those are the things to talk about, not the weather, not what kind of music you like. That's just friendship, which is great to cultivate. But if you get married to somebody, and I had a friend during the COVID vaccine stuff, she went out and got vaccinated, and he had told her, like, we're not taking this vaccine. And it somehow they made it through their marriage. But to me, that would have been like, yeah, done. Like we're done. Sorry, I'm getting divorced now. Whether that's biblical or not. But that's the point, is if you have those conversations first, then situations like that won't arise. That's pretty long-winded, but
that was amazing. That was actually really profound. Yeah, I think there were some great insights and all of that. I mean, I think that's actually a perfect way to end the podcast, honestly, on that more, you could say, on the more serious.
We went all over the place, didn't we?
Yeah, we ended on a very wise and a very loving note, obviously. So yeah, thank you for that. I mean,
Dude, you guys are the shit. Thank you so much for having me.
This
It was
was-
awesome talking to you both.
Yeah,
great.
it was great. We had a really great time. I think this is one of the best podcasts we've actually ever recorded, to be honest. That was great.
That went on for exactly 3 hours and 3 minutes. I just stopped recording.
Crazy.
It's got to be numerology of some sort, dude.